carved in stone, footprints lost to floodwaters, and secrets buried beneath the sea. The evidence is everywhere, and it refuses to explain itself. Mammoth bones broken before humans were supposed to exist. Desert circles with no known builders. Island baskets older than the pyramids. This isn't history. It's a riddle. Welcome to 2 hours of unexplained mysteries about California pre-flood puzzles science still can't solve. And the further back we go, the stranger it gets. If you love vanishing timelines, forbidden questions, and mysteries that only get weirder the deeper you dig, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss a descent like this one. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where are you listening from? And what time is it right now? We're building a map of fellow midnight archaeologists. Cerutti Mastodon. It begins, as many Californian stories do, with a road crew and a backhoe. In 1992, workers widening State Route 54 near San Diego cracked open a layer of ancient soil and stumbled upon something strange: fossilized mastodon bones, massive, splintered, and oddly arranged. Nearby were large stones, some weighing over 15 pounds, showing wear patterns that didn't quite match erosion. At first glance, it looked like just another Ice Age site, another extinct proboscidean, caught in time. But then came the fractures. These mastodon bones weren't just broken, they were smashed. Spiral fractures indicated they were broken while still fresh, still moist with marrow. The bones were shattered in a way that looked disturbingly methodical. And the stones, were they weapons, tools? Some bore the hallmarks of percussion, as if they'd been used like hammers. Others looked like anvils. The dig site, later dubbed the Cerutti Mastodon site, was archived and mostly forgotten for 25 years. Then, in 2017, it roared back to life with a Nature paper that detonated like a fossilized grenade in the world of archaeology. According to the paper's lead authors, including Stephen Holland and Tom Demarais, this wasn't just a fossil site, it was a workshop. They argued that these bones had been deliberately broken by humans for marrow extraction or tool making 130,000 years ago. Let's sit with that for a second. Because if true, that would mean humans, or at least hominins, were in California over 100,000 years earlier than the currently accepted arrival time. Not Clovis, not pre-Clovis. Pre-everything. It would rewrite the human timeline on this continent in bold red ink. Not just tweak it, obliterate it. The paper was met with, let's call it, vociferous skepticism. Critics pointed out that no human bones, no indisputable tools, and no fire pits were found. Others said the bones could have been broken by construction equipment or shifting sediment, or maybe even by other mastodons stepping on them. After all, nature is a messy storyteller. Sometimes, she leaves the plot open to interpretation. But the Cerutti team pushed back. They claimed the stones were too precisely positioned, the breakage too consistent. They ran lab simulations to demonstrate how similar bone damage could be made using stone tools. They swore the mastodon's remains were undisturbed before the road crew unearthed them. One particularly vocal critic, archaeologist John McNabb, diplomatically called the paper a pretty extraordinary claim, which is British for, "I don't buy it." Others were less subtle. The whole episode turned into a kind of academic courtroom drama, complete with expert witnesses, forensic reconstructions, and character assassinations. And yet, through all the noise, one stubborn detail remained. The site was real, the bones were real, and something had crushed them in a way that mimicked intelligent action. So then the question mutates. Even if it wasn't humans, what kind of natural process produces spiral fractures, percussion marks, and neatly adjacent hammerstones in one place? Because if this was just a random geological fluke, it's the Mona Lisa of coincidence, and if it wasn't, well, then someone was here. Long before Clovis points, or shell middens, or cave paintings. Someone who left behind almost nothing, no teeth, No fire, no graves. Just a pile of shattered elephant bones and some heavy stones, like a ghost hunter leaving behind only fingerprints and a crushed wine glass. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. If the Cerutti interpretation is correct, then everything we thought we knew about the peopling of the Americas is off by a full ice age. Our carefully plotted migration models, bearing land, bridge, coastal corridor, etc., start to look like polite fiction. The real story? Maybe it's stranger, messier, more cyclical. Maybe humans or hominins came, vanished, and came again. Not a straight line, but a palimpsest. But even if you accept Cerutti's timeline, a bigger mystery opens up. Where are the others? Where are the tools, the campsites, the burials? You don't just have one random bone-crushing incident and nothing else for 100,000 years. Unless whatever group was here didn't stay, or didn't survive, or wasn't human in the way we think of it. Which leads to an even darker possibility. Maybe they were never meant to leave a trace. So now we have a crime scene with no suspects, just broken bones and unproven intentions, the equivalent of an unsigned letter that simply says, "I was here first." And just when you start to settle into the weirdness, the next mystery drags you deeper. Because about 200 miles northeast, in the windswept Mojave Desert, another dig site claims to be even older, and it's got tens of thousands of so-called tools to prove it. But are they relics of ancient toolmakers, or just rocks pretending to be? You decide. Calico Early Man Site. Out in the scorched belly of the Mojave Desert, where the earth is cracked like a broken promise, and nothing seems to happen quickly. Time included, there's a low, sunburned hill littered with stones. It doesn't look like much, just another dusty rise among many, surrounded by desert varnish and Joshua trees. You could walk right past it and never notice a thing, unless you happen to be looking for a fight with archaeology's version of a family feud. This is the Calico Early Man Site, or as some archaeologists half-jokingly call it, the hill that refuses to be ignored. It began in the early 1962, when Louis Leakey, yes, that Louis Leakey, the godfather of East African paleoanthropology, threw his considerable reputation behind the idea that humans had been in North America for not thousands, but hundreds of thousands of years. And this dusty little hill, just outside Barstow, was going to prove it. Leakey's team uncovered layer after layer of chipped stones, flakes, cores, blades, hammerstones, tens of thousands of them. They believed these were tools, human-made, purposeful. And the layers they were found in, dated by some methods to as much as 200,000 years ago, long before any accepted human presence in the Americas. To understand how controversial this is, you have to appreciate just how firmly entrenched the Clovis first model used to be. For decades, the academic consensus was that the first Americans crossed into the continent around 13,000 years ago, carrying their distinctive fluted points and a taste for megafauna. Calico didn't just nudge that timeline, it drop-kicked it off a cliff. So, of course, the backlash was swift. The problem wasn't that there were stones. There are always stones. The problem was what those stones meant. To Leakey's supporters, they were artifacts tools intentionally flaked by hominin hands. To his critics, they were geofacts, naturally broken rocks, created by freeze-thaw cycles, landslides, or other non-human forces. And let's be honest, nature is a pretty decent forger. She's got time, pressure, and chaos on her side. She's been flaking rocks longer than we've been upright. The arguments turned bitter, then personal. Some accused Leakey of seeing what he wanted to see, tool-shaped rocks in every flake. Others accused mainstream archaeologists of being dogmatically blind to anything that threatened their timelines. It didn't help that Leakey, near the end of his career, was looking for one last paradigm shift. Calico, in many ways, became his final gamble. But the site refused to fade away. Decade after decade, excavations continued. Volunteers, students, and independent researchers kept digging, bagging, cataloging. By now, over 60,000 lithic objects have been recovered from the site. Some are crude, some are ambiguous, and a few are undeniably strange angular flakes with negative bulbs of percussion, bipolar breakage, what looks suspiciously like edge retouching. But even among those who agree that a few pieces look intentional, there's no agreement on who made them or when. If these are tools, then who wielded them? Homo sapiens? Unlikely. Neanderthals? No evidence they crossed the ocean. Denisovans? No bones to back it up. That leaves a darker possibility, an unknown hominin presence now entirely vanished. A ghost species. And if they're not tools? If they're just rockfall debris, weathered shards, and wishful thinking, then what explains the patterning, the concentrations, the recurrence of certain fracture types in certain layers? Are we staring at the illusion of intention? Or is intention simply something we're no longer trained to recognize in forms outside our preferred models? The Calico site is not clean. It's not tidy. It's a junk drawer of a dig confusing stratigraphy, ambiguous contexts, contested dating methods, but it's also persistent. It refuses to go away, and every so often, someone finds a flake that tilts the debate just a little further into uncertainty. In 2009, a new analysis re-examined some of the materials using modern tools and suggested that at least a small subset of the objects might be real artifacts. But that's as far as anyone will go. A maybe. An if. Perhaps worth another look. Calico, like Cerutti, presents a kind of cognitive ambush. It asks not just, what if people were here earlier, but what if our methods aren't good enough to notice when they were? It challenges the gatekeepers of evidence, not just the evidence itself. So here it stands, a hill of broken rocks, buried arguments, and the weight of a reputation that never quite settled. And as you back away from the site, the desert silent around you, the sun baking the hillside in an ancient light, one last thought clings to your mind like static. What if we're not even looking in the right places? Because 200 miles offshore, where the ocean now laps at what was once dry land, lies a drowned world with no name and the ghost of a continent that may have held the answers before the water came. 2 mysteries in, and we're already decades deep into debates that still refuse to fossilize. If your brain's buzzing and your curiosity's spiraling, now's the perfect time to subscribe. This rabbit hole only goes deeper. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it right now? I want to know who else is awake with the ghosts. Arlington Springs human remains. If you're the type who likes your mysteries dry, buried, and dating back to the end of the last ice age, then Santa Rosa Island is your kind of place. Rugged, windswept, and surrounded by waters that conceal more than they reveal, this remote patch of land off California's southern coast once wasn't an island at all. Back then, it was part of a now-drowned super-island called Santa Rosa, a place where Pygmy mammoths once trudged through fog banks and early humans, apparently, beat most of the archaeological record keepers to the punch. In 1959, a UC Santa Barbara archaeologist named Phil Orr was digging a waterline trench on the island when he spotted something that didn't belong. Femur fragments. Human. Not modern. Not recent. They were embedded in a layer of uplifted Pleistocene marine terrace, right next to extinct animal bones. The location, depth, and stratigraphy didn't just suggest age, they screamed it. Orr immediately knew this wasn't just a burial. This was a time capsule. The remains came to be known as Arlington Springs Man, although further analysis revealed they were actually from a woman, approximately in her mid-20 seconds. The misgendering stuck because branding is sticky like that, but so did the intrigue. Initially thought to be around 10,000 years old, subsequent refinements pushed the date back to 13,000 years ago, making her one of the oldest known human individuals ever discovered in the Americas. And yet, for all her importance, she is a ghost of a person, Just fragments of 2 femurs, no tools, no ornaments, no burial goods, no indication of how she lived or how she died. Just a pair of bones, weathered by time, as if her body had been quietly forgotten by both nature and history until a water trench happened to crack her hiding place open. The implications are enormous. If she lived 13,000 years ago on what was already an island, then either she or her ancestors crossed open water to get there, which would mean seafaring, navigation, a planned journey. This wasn't some land bridge pedestrian culture wandering south with spears and a dream. This was maritime adaptation, in deep time. And here's the part that still unsettles archaeologists. There's nothing else like her nearby. No matching graves, no sprawling campsite, no sequence of developmental layers tracing a culture's evolution. Just her, as if she was either one of the first or one of the last. Researchers have tried to draw lines of connection between her and other early Californian coastal populations, between her and the later Chumash or other Channel Islands inhabitants, but there's a canyon of time and missing context between them. Even her DNA is a no-show. There isn't enough preserved to extract any genetic profile. She remains mute, a presence without a story. So how did she get there? One possibility is that her people used boats or rafts to travel from the mainland, following the rich coastal resources, shellfish, kelp, seabirds, that would have made for a maritime corridor of plenty. This theory supports the idea of a kelp highway route into the Americas, where early humans hugged the Pacific Rim instead of trudging inland through glacial corridors. But if that's true, where are the boats? Or the harpoons? Or the middens? Early coastal sites should be all over the place. But many are either eroded, buried, or now lying under 300 feet of Pacific Ocean, thanks to post-Ice Age sea level rise. Santa Rosa, the super island she once stood on, was later split into today's 4 northern Channel Islands by rising tides. The archaeological record, in a very literal sense, drowned. Her story might be a casualty of global melt. Some researchers argue that she may not have lived permanently on the island, but was part of a group that moved seasonally or semi-nomadically between land and sea, perhaps blown off course, perhaps interred far from home. Others point out that if early seafarers did exist along the Pacific coast, they would have faced fewer technological hurdles than Ice Age inlanders, no need for snow gear or megafauna kills, just reliable flotation and an eye for the tides. But even that is a kind of educated guess. What remains constant is how little we know and how much we assume. Arlington Springs woman misnamed, misplaced, and almost entirely misunderstood sits at the origin point of something bigger than her. She represents not just a person, but a possibility. That humans were more mobile, more adaptable, and more technologically capable at the dawn of American history than we've given them credit for. And then there's the oddity of her isolation. If she was one among many, then where did the others go? If she was alone, then why here? If she wasn't alone, but all the others are underwater, then what else is lying out there, waiting? It's hard to look at her few surviving bones without imagining a whole population behind her, a community erased by time, water, and the slow forgetfulness of geology. But while she remains stranded in mystery, the cave next door tells a different story. On a neighboring island, in a dark chamber lined with shell and soot, archaeologists found a hint of something older. A cave where time is layered in smoke and cordage, and the echoes of human hands have clung to the walls for over 10,000 years. We call it Daisy Cave, and it just might be where the silence begins to speak. Daisy Cave. To reach Daisy Cave, you first have to cross the channel. Not metaphorically, literally. The Pacific Ocean still guards its secrets with the same cold, indifferent vastness it always has. Today, you can make the journey by boat or helicopter. 15,000 years ago, it would have been logs lashed with fiber, hides stretched tight over frames, or something stranger still, an invention now lost beneath layers of salt and time. but the people who reached San Miguel Island did it anyway. Daisy Cave sits like a hidden mouth in the side of a sea-scraped bluff, carved by wind and patience, facing the great blue. It doesn't look like the kind of place where history changes. Just a modest chamber, part cave, part rock shelter, partially collapsed. But what it lacks in glamour, it makes up for in depth of time, of evidence, of unsettling implications. Inside, archaeologists have peeled back the layers like pages of a silent journal. Shell, middens, charcoal flecks, woven fibers, and human presence, stretching back more than 11,000 years, possibly as far as 12,500. In other words, this cave was occupied around the same time as, or even before, the famed Clovis hunters were napping their fluted points out on the open plains. Only this wasn't a kill site. There are no bison skeletons here, no mammoth traps. What you find at Daisy Cave is something far subtler and arguably more impressive. Evidence of fishing, of foraging, of weaving, basketry fragments and cordage so old they seem almost mythical. The fingerprints of a maritime culture that wasn't just surviving, it was adapting with sophistication that still surprises scientists today. Among the recovered items were abalone shells, fish bones, bird remains, and sea urchins, an entire ecological record of coastal living. These weren't just occasional island visitors. These were people who understood their surroundings intimately. They knew when the tides shifted, when the shellfish spawned, and which cliffs sang with the sound of nesting birds. They brought with them tools made of stone, bone, and fiber, crafted with intention. They used fire, they built shelter, they returned. One of the more compelling finds is the cordage itself. It's not flashy, but it's quietly revolutionary. Spun from plant fibers, twisted and braided, these fragments suggest not just technological ingenuity, but planning. Cordage means nets, snares, basket traps. It means containers, slings, and ties. It means knowledge passed from hand to hand, likely across generations. And the baskets? Though only small remnants were preserved in the dry conditions of the cave, they are among the earliest known basketry in North America. In a discipline that often defaults to spear points and butchered bones as the indicators of intelligence, Daisy Cave presents an argument in woven silence. Technology is not always violent. Even more provocative is what's not found. Clovis points, or anything like them. This site doesn't seem to connect directly to the land-based traditions of the interior. It may represent a separate lineage of coastal adaptation, one that's been largely overlooked, in part because so much of it has since been claimed by the sea. Indeed, as sea levels rose after the end of the last ice age, much of the ancient coastline was drowned, along with whatever camps, villages, or sacred sites it may have held. The people who once fished from those shores are now shadows on the edge of the archaeological record. What we see in Daisy Cave may be just a fragment of what once stretched across hundreds of miles of now submerged shelf. And yet, for all this, Daisy Cave raises more questions than it answers. Who were these people? Where did they come from? Did they develop this maritime lifestyle independently, or was it brought with them from an even earlier migration? Could they be related to the Arlington Springs woman? Or to populations further north or west, perhaps even across the Pacific? No one can say for sure. The answers, if they exist, are buried under centuries of erosion or drowned beneath the ocean. But what Daisy Cave does confirm without ambiguity is that people were thriving on California's islands long before conventional models said they should be. And that opens a door. If Daisy Cave holds evidence of early, sophisticated seafaring societies, then the surrounding waters may be hiding entire worlds, villages, artifacts, graves now submerged, unexcavated, unseen. Which brings us to a place that doesn't exist anymore. Not on any modern map, at least. It's called Santa Rosa, a paleo-coastal dreamscape, a drowned island that once connected the northern Channel Islands into one massive landmass. And if Daisy Cave is just the edge of the story, then Santa Rosa might be the lost chapter. Drowned world of Santa Rosa. Before the sea came back, there was more land here. A lot more. Stretching across what's now the misty expanse between Santa Rosa, San Miguel, Santa Cruz, and Anacapa Islands was a single, sprawling island, Santa Rosa. It was a place where wind met cliffs, where herds of pygmy mammoths grazed on native grasslands, and where the first Californians may have launched their boats into deep time. It no longer exists above the surface. But for most of the last ice age, Santa Rosa was a real, continuous landscape. 4 modern islands, now stranded remnants of its ancient whole. And here's the thing. We know it was inhabited. We just don't know how much. The basic math is staggering. Around 20,000 years ago, global sea levels were over 300 feet lower than today. That lowered the Pacific enough to expose a massive island off the coast of Southern California. Santa Rosa approximately 3 to 4 times larger than all the current northern Channel Islands combined. It was closer to the mainland, easier to access, and rich in resources. Fresh water, edible plants, migratory birds, marine mammals, shellfish, and fish of every kind. A paleo-coastal paradise. And then, slowly, it sank. Not all at once, but steadily, relentlessly. Sea level rise doesn't care about archaeology. By 9,000 years ago, Santa Rosa had been swallowed by the ocean's slow return. Its shores had fractured, its inland valleys drowned. What had once been a single landmass was broken apart into 4 islands, isolated and shrinking, their ancient harbors long underwater. Whatever people had lived, fished, traveled, or built upon that land, their sites went with it. That's the central mystery. What did we lose when Santa Rosa vanished? We know that people were living on it. Daisy Cave, on what's now San Miguel Island, dates to over 11,000 years ago. CASRI 26, on today's Santa Rosa, adds even more evidence of paleocoastal occupation. But these are just the high points, the parts of the island that stayed above water long enough to be found. What's likely is that the earliest, richest human activity was centered on Santa Rosa's now submerged coastlines, places that are currently unreachable, inaccessible, or buried under thick layers of silt and kelp forest. Coastal societies tend to live on the coast after all. That means we're probably missing the best parts of the story. Imagine if someone tried to reconstruct modern civilization 10,000 years from now but only had access to mountain cabins. No cities, no ports, no highways, just the forgotten hills. That's essentially where we are with Santa Rosa. Underneath the waves lie drowned shorelines, terraces, and Paleochannel's ancient riverbeds that once carried fresh water into estuaries where humans could have fished, camped, and crafted. Recent bathymetric mapping has revealed submerged landforms that look suspiciously like prime real estate for early settlers. Sheltered coves, gently sloping beaches, river mouths. So why haven't we explored them more? 2 reasons: difficulty and danger. Underwater archaeology is expensive, technically demanding, and filled with complications. Visibility is often poor. Currents are treacherous. Artifacts are fragile, buried under meters of silt or trapped in compacted sands. And there's the legal maze. Offshore excavation requires permits, tribal consultations, and a lot of caution. No one wants to disturb ancestral heritage without certainty, and certainty is in short supply. But the hints keep piling up. Some researchers believe that many of the missing coastal sites, those we'd expect to find if humans really arrived here early, are simply underwater now. And Santa Rosa is the best candidate. It fits every model for early maritime migration, a natural stopping point for seafarers moving along the Pacific coast. A place where small bands could fish, gather, rest, and leave behind the subtle traces of their passing. If even one submerged site is found, just one hearth, one flake tool, one post hole in an ancient terrace, It could rewrite everything we thought we knew about early settlement patterns in North America. Because if people were living here before the island split, then they were living here when the world looked entirely different, when sea levels were low, megafauna still roamed, and the mainland was only a short paddle away. They would have seen the ocean coming back, inch by inch, watched the water take their camps, their hunting grounds, their sacred places. Maybe they moved uphill. Maybe they left. Maybe they tried to build something that wouldn't wash away, something durable, something with barbs. Because here's where it turns again. Among the artifacts left behind on the surviving islands of Santa Rosa is a collection of barbed projectile points, strange, elegant, and unlike anything else on the mainland from the same time. A toolkit born not of land-chasing hunters, but of sea watchers, people whose lives were tied not to herds, but to tides. The mystery? We still don't know exactly who made them, or where they learned how. Channel Islands Paleo-Coastal Toolkit. In a world where survival often meant sprinting after a mammoth with a pointed stick, the people of the Channel Islands took a different approach. They turned their gaze to the sea, not out of desperation, but out of design. And what they left behind, scattered across the windswept cliffs and eroding dunes of Santa Rosa and San Miguel Islands, is not just a toolkit. It's a riddle in flaked stone, barbed bone, and bone-deep irony. The so-called Channel Islands Paleo-Coastal Toolkit, a collection of distinctive projectile points, fish hooks, scrapers, and bifaces, dates back to around 12,200 to 11,200 years ago. This places it among the oldest known maritime tool assemblages in North America, and unlike the fluted Clovis points that dominated the continental interior, these tools tell a very different story, a coastal story, a seafaring story, possibly an independent one. At the center of this mystery is a particular point-style stemmed and barbed projectile points, sometimes referred to as Channel Island barbed. Thin, symmetrical, often with fine pressure flaking, these points look like they were designed not for hunting massive land animals, but for spearing fish, sea mammals, or maybe even diving birds. Their craftsmanship suggests a knowledge of hydrodynamics, a sense of what works best when you're hunting in and around water, not across it. That distinction matters because these tools don't just represent a different lifestyle, they may represent a different lineage. The prevailing theory for decades was that the Clovis culture, the so-called First Americans, spread rapidly across the continent from the interior, bringing their toolkit with them. But the Channel Islands toolkit throws sand in that machine. These tools aren't Clovis. They aren't even close. There are no fluted points, no megafauna kill sites, no inland-style technology. Instead, what you find are small, precise, stemmed tools, some with barbs, others leaf-shaped, all seemingly optimized for a narrow band of marine-oriented life. These weren't people running after buffalo. They were netting fish, skinning seals, gathering shellfish, and if the evidence is right, doing it all with a maritime strategy nearly 12,000 years ago. That raises two thorny questions. Where did these tool styles come from? And how are they related to what was happening on the mainland? One camp argues that the Paleo-Coastal Toolkit represents a local innovation, a seafaring culture adapting to the unique demands of island life. After all, when you're surrounded by water and short on big game, you don't need Clovis points, you need bone, awls, fish hooks, and barbed harpoons. In this view, the Channel Islands tools are a natural evolution from a shared ancestral toolkit, customized to fit a watery world. But another more controversial idea has floated to the surface. What if these tools didn't descend from Clovis at all? What if they came from a parallel migration, one that traveled along the Pacific coast, perhaps from Siberia, Japan, or Southeast Asia using boats, exploiting kelp forests, and leaving behind a distinct technological signature? In other words, what if Clovis wasn't first? What if they weren't even alone? This Dual route hypothesis that coastal peoples moved south along the Pacific at the same time as, or even before, inland migrants has gained traction in recent years. The Channel Islands Paleocoastal Toolkit is one of its strongest cards. The tools don't fit into the Clovis family tree, but they do show continuity with stemmed points found at other coastal sites, stretching from Oregon to Baja California. It's not just about points, though. Other tools in the assemblage, such as abraders, flakes, and bladelets, suggest a diversified economy. These weren't just hunters, they were crafters, carvers, weavers. Some of the barbed points show signs of resharpening. Others were snapped, possibly during use. That level of wear tells a quiet but profound story. These tools weren't ceremonial. They were practical, lived in, trusted. And the people who made them? We don't know what they called themselves. Their language, rituals, and stories are long gone, but what remains is a ghost trail of ingenuity. They knew how to build watercraft, navigate treacherous currents, and extract sustenance from a sometimes unforgiving ecosystem. They had no written language, no metal, no beasts of burden, just the rhythm of the waves, the shape of the wind, and the knowledge locked in stone and bone. It's this contrast, the refinement of their tools, and the crudeness of our understanding that gives the mystery its bite. Because here's the thing, while these barbed points are mainly found on the Channel Islands, very few of them appear inland on the California mainland. This geographic separation raises more questions. Did these maritime people avoid the mainland? Were they culturally distinct? Was the sea not just their road, but their boundary? Or maybe they were simply erased, swallowed by time, tide, and the rising sea that drowned so much of their world. And if you think these barbed points are strange, wait until you see the ones shaped like moons. Tiny, curved tools that show up in the same places: wetlands, marshes, lake beds, always in crescent form. Their function? Still debated. Their origin? Uncertain. But their mystery? Sharpened. Like everything else in this ancient coastal puzzle, the crescent enigma. They look like commas carved in stone, or tiny boomerangs, curved just so, small enough to fit in the palm of your hand. Archaeologists call them lunate crescents, modest in size, enigmatic in purpose, and widespread enough to make a point but vague enough that no one can agree on what that point island. Across California and the western United States, from the fog-laced Channel Islands to the alkaline basins of Nevada and the sagebrush wetlands of Oregon, these crescent-shaped tools show up again and again, always in proximity to water, always with a kind of subtle consistency, curved edges, delicate retouching, chipped from chalcedony or obsidian, and always with questions trailing behind. The so-called crescent enigma sits at the intersection of technological function, environmental adaptation, and archaeological confusion. What were they for? How were they used? And who exactly kept dropping these cryptic tools across the landscape, like a breadcrumb trail from a vanished culture? Let's start with what we know, or at least, what we think we know. Lunate crescents appear mostly in Pleistocene and early Holocene contexts, roughly 12,000 to 8,000 years ago, give or take several centuries and a few disagreements. They're almost always found in areas that were once rich in water: lake margins, riverbanks, marshlands, or coastal estuaries. Places now often dry or transformed entirely, but once teeming with lifebirds, fish, amphibians, and small mammals. The crescents themselves come in multiple styles: lunate, half-moon, barbed, winged, and sometimes shouldered. Some are perfectly symmetrical, others oddly asymmetrical, as if the maker was improvising. Most are finely made pressure flaked with care, often from brittle volcanic glass or translucent stone that chips beautifully but unforgivingly, the kind of material that doesn't tolerate sloppy craftsmanship. Which brings us to the first clue. These weren't casual tools. Someone spent time on them. They were intentional, purpose-driven. But what was the purpose? One theory suggests that crescents were part of hunting toolkits, possibly mounted on darts or atlatl shafts, used to hunt waterfowl. Their wide, curved shape might have helped catch or slow birds in flight or tangle in feathers. Others speculate they were used more like knives or scrapers, cutting through sinew or reeds, or processing fish and aquatic plants. But here's the problem. We haven't found any with confirmed hafting residues. No wooden shafts, no sinew bindings, no adhesives. In fact, no one's entirely sure how they were mounted, if at all. Another idea casts them as multi-use tools, a kind of prehistoric Swiss Army blade, sharp enough to cut, curved enough to skin, sturdy enough to use again and again. But again, direct evidence is elusive. Experimental archaeology has reproduced their forms, tested their functions, even flung them through the air. Results are mixed. Some scholars go further into abstraction. Could crescents have been symbolic, ceremonial, markers of identity, or status, or group affiliation? Their distinctive form does echo celestial imagery: the moon, the cycle, the curve of a horizon. Maybe they had spiritual significance. Maybe they were talismans. Or perhaps, as one researcher put it, they were ritual litter objects meant to be deposited, not used. But if they were symbols, why are they so consistently found in wet environments? That water association keeps coming back like a tide. Crescents cluster near ancient lakes and marshes, places that would have drawn not just animals, but people, especially early people, adapting to post-glacial environments in flux. It's possible crescents were part of a specialized wetland hunting culture, one now largely erased by climate shifts and droughts. And here's where the mystery sharpens. Because these crescents aren't evenly distributed across all early Californian sites. They show up disproportionately on the Channel Islands, particularly in association with early maritime toolkits. That suggests something more than chance, possibly a shared tradition, possibly a coastal migration. Did these early seafarers carry crescents with them as part of a unified hunting strategy? Were they adapting inland tools for island life? Or was it the other way around? Was the crescent a coastal invention that spread inland along river routes and seasonal wetlands? No one knows. No one agrees. Some even question whether all these so-called crescents are related at all. Could it be convergent design? Multiple groups, responding to similar environments in similar ways? Or are we once again falling into the oldest trap in archaeology, seeing connection where there is only coincidence? Whatever the answer, the crescents keep appearing, in eroding dunes, in desiccated playas, on islands that were once peaks of a larger, drowned land. They outlast the theories. They outlast the cultures that may have made them. And for now, they remain as they are, sharp, silent, and unresolved. But just when you think the mystery can't twist any further, another site opens up on Santa Rosa Island, layered with artifacts, bone, and shell, and offers what might be the earliest full picture of a paleo-coastal settlement. Not just tools, but context. A chance to see how all these pieces, points, crescents, fishhooks, fit together. If they ever really did. .ca 26. The name doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, CASRI 26, but behind this sterile cataloging code is one of the most important and mystifying archaeological sites in all of coastal California. Buried beneath the grassy dunes of Santa Rosa Island, surrounded by the salty wind and sun-bleached silence of the Pacific, lies a snapshot of paleo-coastal life, more vivid and more haunting than most. This site isn't famous. It doesn't headline documentaries or pop up in tourist brochures. It's not adorned with monuments or roped-off signage. And yet, it's quietly one of the most significant prehistoric sites in North America. Roughly 11,700 years old, CASRI 26 is one of the oldest securely dated human occupation sites on the California Channel Islands. That date alone puts it on the short list of evidence that humans were not only present on these islands during the terminal Pleistocene, but were actively exploiting marine resources in complex, organized ways. But what makes CASRI-26 really intriguing is how much it reveals and how many questions remain unanswered despite that. First discovered in the 1,960 seconds, the site was partially excavated in fits and starts over decades. Each return visit peeled back another layer of human presence. Archaeologists uncovered charcoal-stained soil, shell, midden deposits, projectile points, bone tools, fish remains, sea mammal bones, and the remains of seabirds. In other words, the leftovers of an economy tied to the sea. A culture that wasn't just visiting the island but living there, feeding families, making tools, navigating tides, and doing so at a time when most of the continent was still shaking off the last ice. What makes this all more surreal is the setting. Santa Rosa Island, now barren and windswept, wasn't always so desolate. Back then, it was still connected to the super-island of Santa Rosa, closer to the mainland, surrounded by lush marine ecosystems and freshwater seeps. The inhabitants of CASRI-26 would have looked out at a coastline now long drowned, perhaps watched mammoths walking in the distance, perhaps lit fires against the fog. The site's remains are rich, dense with cultural material, but not showy. No great monuments, no elaborate burials, no enormous shell mounds or ceremonial platforms. What CASRI-26 offers is something subtler: continuity, occupation over time, repeated visits, maybe even seasonal settlement. The kind of pattern that suggests not a one-off expedition or shipwrecked accident, but a plan, a cultural rhythm. And yet, that rhythm is hard to decipher. One of the most debated questions is whether the site represents a year-round village or a seasonal camp. Some researchers argue that the pattern of remains, especially the kinds of fish and shellfish, found points to temporary occupation during the warmer months, possibly during seasonal migrations from the mainland. Others contend that the level of investment tool production, bone processing, shell disposal implies a more permanent, or at least more frequent presence. Either way, the people of CASRI-26 were no amateurs. They understood the sea. They were hunting seals, catching fish, gathering shellfish. They had tools designed specifically for this environment: barbed points for marine mammals, flaked blades for processing catch, grinding stones for seeds and plants. They weren't surviving. They were thriving. And they were doing it in one of the oldest island-based settlements ever recorded in North America. And yet, one detail lingers in the background, unsettling in its absence. We don't know who they were. Not their names, not their language, not their myths or songs or the shape of their beliefs. No burials have been conclusively tied to this earliest period at CASRI-26. No DNA has been recovered. No preserved human figures. No faces looking back. Just tools. Just traces. Just the unmistakable signature of presence without identity. What's worse is how close we are to losing even that. Like many coastal sites, CASRI-26 is under threat from erosion, rising sea levels, animal burrowing, and even tourism. The very forces that preserved this place for millennia are now eating it away, year by year. The layers are fragile, the context delicate. Every winter storm takes a little more with it. And still, we don't have the full story. Were these people connected to the Arlington Springs individual? To the toolmakers at Daisy Cave? Were they a separate group entirely? Did they sail between islands, maintain trading routes, share tool styles and food sources? Or was this just one of many attempts, some successful, some not, to claim a foothold on a shrinking coast? For now, CASRI-26 is a rare window, a high and dry glimpse at a lost world, one where lucky still exists above the tide line. But it's not the only relic of that world. Just beyond its dunes, on these very same islands, tiny mammoths once roamed, strange, shrunken descendants of mainland giants. And in their fossilized footprints, we find another mystery. One that asks an even stranger question. Did the first humans here arrive just in time to see the last mammoths disappear? Pygmy mammoths, Mammuthus exilis, Channel Islands. They were real, they were small, and they were doomed. If you've ever imagined California as a land of megafaunal drama, saber-toothed cats slinking through golden hills, mammoths lumbering across grassy plains, then the Channel Islands might come as a surprise. Because here, on these wind-swept ridges and foggy bluffs, mammoths didn't grow bigger, they got smaller. Meet Mammuthus exilis, the pygmy mammoth. Standing just 4 to 6 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing in at about a ton, roughly the size of a large horse, this now extinct species was a miniature version of its mainland ancestor, the Columbian mammoth, Mammothus columbi. And it wasn't just a rare mutation. It was a full-blown evolutionary adaptation to island life. Fewer predators, limited resources, no need to tower over anything except shrubs and grass. Classic island dwarfism, a phenomenon so predictable it's almost formulaic. When big animals get stuck on islands, they shrink. But even so, seeing a mammoth the size of a pickup truck wander across a cliffside above the Pacific, that's a kind of strange no evolutionary law can prepare you for. The process wasn't overnight. Genetic studies suggest that Columbian mammoths swam or were swept to the Channel Islands somewhere around 300,000 to 200,000 years ago, a feat in itself, considering that even at their closest, the islands were separated from the mainland by several miles of open water. But mammoths are surprisingly strong swimmers, and sea levels were lower during the Pleistocene. It wouldn't have taken much a major flood, a family of risk-takers, or simply the slow drift of opportunity. Once on the islands, isolated from the mainland gene pool and facing limited food and space, natural selection kicked in. Over tens of thousands of years, the population shrank not in numbers, necessarily, but in size. Bones got shorter, tusks got thinner, the mighty became modest. Evolution, with its dry sense of humor, traded grandeur for efficiency. By the late Pleistocene, Mammuthus exilis had become the dominant herbivore on Santa Rosa, the now drowned super island that once connected Santa Rosa, San Miguel, Santa Cruz, and Anacapa. Fossil sites across these islands confirm that the pygmy mammoths were thriving here well into the twilight of the last ice age, grazing, wandering, dying, leaving behind molars, ribs, and the occasional eerie set of tracks baked into ancient clay. But then, suddenly, or maybe not so suddenly, they vanished. And this is where the mystery blooms. The exact extinction date of the pygmy mammoth is still debated. Some radiocarbon dates suggest they were gone by 13,000 years ago. Others hint at survival as late as 11,000 years ago, possibly overlapping with the earliest human presence on the islands. That overlap is the fulcrum of the puzzle. Because if humans and pygmy mammoths coexisted even for just a few centuries, it raises a tantalizing set of questions. Did humans hunt them? Did human arrival disturb their fragile island ecosystem? Or were these little mammoths already spiraling toward extinction long before any canoe crested the horizon? So far, the evidence is ambiguous. Unlike the La Brea tar pits or the mammoth kill sites of the interior, the Channel Islands offer no clear signs of mammoth hunting, no butchered bones, no weapon points embedded in ribs. There's a curious absence of violence, which might mean nothing, or everything. It's entirely possible that climate played the lead role. As the Ice Age ended, the islands shrank. Rising sea levels carved Santa Rosa into 4 smaller, more isolated islands. Freshwater sources dried up. Vegetation patterns shifted. And the mammoths, specialized for one kind of world, found themselves trapped in another. One that was too warm, too small, too human. Still, some researchers aren't ready to let us off the hook. They point out that even minimal human interference, occasional hunting, competition for water, introduction of new microbes might have been enough to tip the balance. Especially on islands, where ecosystems hang by threads. It doesn't take a spear to kill a species. Sometimes all it takes is presence. And here's the most haunting part. Some mammoth fossils have been found in stratigraphic layers close to early human occupation sites, suggesting a potential overlap in both space and time. Nothing conclusive. Just proximity. A kind of archaeological side-eye that hints at lost interactions we can't quite confirm. Were the last pygmy mammoths seen by human eyes? Were they remembered in story, passed down in oral tradition, turned into symbols? Or did they slip away quietly, unnoticed, their bones buried in silence? We may never know, but the possibility, that image of an early islander watching a small, shuffling mammoth vanish into the mist, clings to the imagination. And just when you think the island can't surprise you anymore, you take a flight eastward to the dusty desert floor of the Colorado River basin. No mammoths there, no misty bluffs. Just giants of another kind, massive figures etched into the earth, visible only from the sky. Their meaning? Unknown. Their origin? Disputed. Their silence? Deafening. Blythe intaglios, Lower Colorado River. From above, they resemble ancient ghosts, long-limbed, stretched thin, arms upraised like dancers or sky watchers or someone mid-ritual. Giant figures pressed into the surface of the desert, etched not in paint or pigment, but by the deliberate removal of earth. They don't scream for attention. They don't glow with color or shimmer and light. They whisper so faintly that you wouldn't know they were there unless you were flying directly over them. These are the Blythe intaglios, a set of enormous geoglyphs etched into the desert floor of southeastern California along the western banks of the Lower Colorado River. 6 figures, scattered across the gravelly alluvial plains north of Blythe, ranging from 95 to 170 feet in length. They are, quite literally, too large to see from the ground. Only from the air can you make sense of them. 2 humanoid figures, several quadrupeds, possibly mountain lions or bighorn sheep, and abstract geometric shapes. All made by removing the dark patina of desert varnish to reveal the lighter soil beneath. Their sheer scale is astonishing. One figure, the largest of the humanoids, is nearly the length of a football field. No scaffolding, no blueprint, no aerial photography, just someone, or some group, laying out enormous designs with stunning symmetry and intent, which raises the obvious, uncomfortable question: who made them, and why? There's no single answer. Oral traditions from indigenous groups in the region, especially the Mojave and Quechan, offer clues. Some say the human-like figures may represent mythological beings, such as Mustamho, a creator figure in Quechan cosmology. Others suggest the geoglyphs were made as part of ceremonial practices, ritual dance grounds, pilgrimage markers, or spiritual beacons meant for the sky. But these explanations are just that, interpretations. As far as scientific consensus goes, the Blythe intaglios remain deeply, frustratingly undated. Attempts to pinpoint their age have yielded wide margins. Some archaeologists argue they could be as recent as 1,000 years old. Others suggest they might date back 2,000 years or more. Without organic material directly associated with the figures, radiocarbon dating is nearly impossible. And geomorphological dating tracking erosion, soil movement, and desert varnish regrowth is notoriously tricky and speculative. Which means the Blythe intaglios sit in a kind of interpretive vacuum. Ancient, maybe sacred, probably, but still lacking a narrative we can confirm. The bigger mystery, however, isn't just who made them, it's how. Think about what it would take to create a 170-foot-long figure with only ground-level perspective. No drones, no airplanes, no mountains nearby tall enough to see your work. Yet the proportions are consistent, the figures deliberate, not crude. There's no evidence of trial and error. No abandoned lines or distorted limbs, just intention. Some researchers speculate the creators used a system of wooden stakes and cordage to lay out the shapes, a kind of ancient blueprinting method. Others believe they relied on ritual intuition, oral direction, or forms of measurement we haven't yet recognized. Whatever the case, they succeeded at something that today would require GPS and aerial verification. And that's not the only eerie thing about them. The Blythe intaglios are part of a much larger regional pattern. All across the lower Colorado River region in California, Arizona, and Baja, dozens of similar geoglyphs have been found. Some are humanoid. Some are animalistic. Some are just circles or spirals or massive lines that stretch across the desert for no clear reason. Many are situated near ancient trails, water sources, or known pilgrimage routes. Together, they suggest a kind of symbolic landscape, a prehistoric canvas on a massive scale, designed not just to be seen, but to be felt. Yet, despite their scale and frequency, most remain unprotected, unstudied, or simply unknown to the public. Some have been damaged by off-road vehicles. Others have faded under wind and time. A few are preserved behind fences, like zoo exhibits for forgotten cosmologies. And all of them pose the same unsolved riddle: why build something no one on the ground could fully see? Were they meant for spirits in the sky? For gods? For celestial travelers? Were they territorial markers, warning signs, or invitations? Did they coincide with astronomical alignments, solstice rituals, or funerary rites? We don't know. What we do know is that they required time, planning, and communal effort. They were not random. They were not made in isolation. And their creators clearly operated within a cosmology that saw no division between land, sky, spirit, and symbol. Which makes the silence even louder, because just a few miles south of the Blythe figures lies another, lesser-known geoglyph, smaller, fenced, and oddly solitary. Known simply as the Yuha Desert Geoglyph, it too defies explanation. It too points nowhere obvious, and it too waits, in the sun-baked gravel, for someone to remember what it meant. Yuha Desert Geoglyph, Imperial County. It doesn't announce itself. No towering figure, no dramatic animal form galloping across the desert floor. Just a quiet arrangement of gravel and space in the remote southwestern corner of Imperial County, California. A single geoglyph, modest in comparison to the grand intaglios near Blythe, but equally puzzling. This is the Yuha Desert Geoglyph, located near the US-Mexico border in a dry, unyielding stretch of desert that most drivers speed past without a second glance. Blink, and you'll miss it. And even if you don't blink, you might still miss it unless you're looking from above or walking slowly with a sense of symbolic gravity. The geoglyph itself is simple. A rectangular or trapezoidal figure made by clearing the dark desert varnish, those black, manganese-rich pebbles that coat the ground, and exposing the lighter-colored soil beneath. As with the Blythe intaglios, no pigment was used, no carving into stone, just the careful removal of surface rocks to create contrast, negative space as expression. And while it might not scream for attention, the questions it raises are thunderous. Who made it? When? Why? Unlike some of the more famous geoglyphs in the region, the Yuha figure lacks dramatic scale. It's not 100 feet long. It's not clearly anthropomorphic or zoomorphic. There's no bold gesture here, no outstretched arms or racing animal shapes. It's geometric, deliberate, yet cryptic. A shape you can't unsee once you've seen it, but also one you can't quite explain. And therein lies the mystery. Because even among specialists, there is no consensus on the geoglyph's meaning, age, or cultural origin. Some scholars believe it could date back hundreds or even thousands of years, possibly made by indigenous peoples of the Colorado Desert region, perhaps by ancestors of the Kumeyaay or other local tribes. But there is no direct material to date, no organic residue, no associated artifacts, just pattern and stone and place. Others argue for a much more recent origin. There's been speculation mostly by skeptics that the geoglyph could be modern perhaps a 19th or 20th century trail marker, a rancher's landmark, or even a border-era surveying symbol. But again, there's no solid evidence to support this either, just theories in the sand. What is clear is that the site was already considered culturally significant by the mid-20th century, when local indigenous leaders requested that it be preserved and protected. The Bureau of Land Management fenced it off and added a marker, but the interpretation sign doesn't explain much. In fact, it raises more questions than it answers, filled with cautious phrasing like may have been, possibly used for, believed to be. This isn't evasion, it's honesty. The truth is that no one really knows what this site meant, not definitively, and that makes it rare. Not in form, there are other geoglyphs across the Southwest, but in ambiguity. Because this one refuses categorization, it doesn't play by the rules of recognizable iconography. Some believe the geoglyph could be related to ceremonial movement, a kind of desert waypoint where dances or prayers marked significant moments in an annual cycle. The Yuha Desert has long been crisscrossed by indigenous trails, spiritual, seasonal, and practical. Pilgrimage was not uncommon. Could this have been a sacred stop on the way to somewhere else? Another possibility. It functioned as an astronomical marker, aligned with solstices or cardinal directions. Researchers have noted that many southwestern geoglyphs exhibit orientation patterns not random, not accidental, but cosmically tuned. But here again, the data is inconclusive. You can draw the lines if you want to, but do they reflect intentionality, or just confirmation bias dressed up in geometry? Then there's the deeper mystery, the psychological one. Why build something that nobody at ground level can properly see? It's a question that echoes from Blythe to Nazca. Was the act of making the geoglyph more important than seeing it in full? Was the knowledge of its shape held by those who built it, passed down orally, or internalized as sacred knowledge? Was it meant for the sky? For spirits? For birds? For time itself? Because if you stand at the edge of the fence today and stare out across the figure barely visible against the sun-hammered ground, you realize something profound. This was never about spectacle. It was about intention. Someone chose to make this shape, to clear this space, to inscribe the earth in silence. And unlike so many cultural expressions, petroglyphs, basketry, song, this geoglyph left no story behind, no preserved chant or myth or oral annotation, only stones, arranged in absence. The Yuha Desert geoglyph doesn't tell us what it means. It tells us that someone cared to mean something. And that might be why its mystery still resonates. Because just north of here, in a basin surrounded by scorched volcanic ridges, lies an entirely different form of desert art, not subtractive like the geoglyphs, but incised, thousands of carvings. Layers of symbology, a gallery etched into black volcanic cliffs. It's called the Koso Range petroglyphs, and if the Yuha geoglyph is a whisper, the Kosos are a shout echoing through stone. Koso Range petroglyphs, China. Out in the high desert of eastern California, tucked between the jagged ridgelines and volcanic slopes near China Lake, lies one of the greatest archaeological treasures in North America. But you wouldn't know it at first glance. The terrain is stark, silent, windswept rock and sagebrush. Not much in the way of water or shelter. It's the kind of place most people pass through quickly on their way to somewhere else. But look closer, closer still, and the rocks begin to speak. They're speaking in lines, spirals, grids, bighorn sheep by the hundreds, human figures, some with antlers, some mid-transformation, weapons, footprints, abstract forms, all etched into the desert varnish, dark rock flaked away to reveal lighter stone beneath. These are the Koso Range petroglyphs, one of the densest and most enigmatic concentrations of prehistoric rock art on the continent. Over 100,000 individual carvings spread across canyons, ridges, and rock faces. They are not random, they are not accidental, and they are not yet fully understood. Located on restricted military land within the Naval Air Weapons Station China Lake, The Koso petroglyph fields have been protected, paradoxically, by their inaccessibility. You can't just hike in. Visitation is limited, controlled, bureaucratically tangled. As a result, the carvings have been spared much of the graffiti and destruction that plague other sites. But they've also remained relatively mysterious, visible, but not fully revealed. So what exactly is going on out there in the Kosos? Let's start with the images themselves. The most striking and numerous motif is the bighorn sheep stylized, often exaggerated, depicted in motion, sometimes pierced with arrows. Some scenes show entire herds. Others show human figures confronting or transforming into the animals. These aren't just illustrations. They're stories. But we don't have the key to the language. Were they hunting records, ritual preparations, spiritual invocations? Possibly all three. One interpretation sees the petroglyphs as part of hunting magic, a visual form of sympathetic ritual intended to ensure success in the real world. Draw the sheep, strike the sheep, and you've already begun the process of the hunt. This isn't superstition. It's cosmology where action, symbol, and outcome are intertwined. But others see more than just hunting. Some of the figures have antlers sprouting from their heads, what scholars call shamanic imagery. These aren't hunters, they're transformers. People mid-transition between human and animal, mortal and spirit. They appear alongside grids, dots, and abstract patterns, signs that may encode cosmological maps, memory systems, or altered states of consciousness. The petroglyphs, in this view, are portals, access points to the sacred, to the unseen. The sheer scale of the site complicates things. This isn't a casual rock panel here or there. It's a massive, regionally significant complex that likely spanned centuries, if not millennia, of cultural activity. Some carvings have been tentatively dated back as far as 10,000 years, though most likely cluster between 3,000 and 1,000 years ago. But again, dating petroglyphs is an inexact science. Desert varnish accumulates slowly, weathering rates vary. The carvings themselves provide no clear timestamps. And even if we could date them precisely, the bigger question looms: who made them? There's no single answer. The region has been home to multiple native groups over time. The Koso people, the Timbisha Shoshone, the Kawaiisu. Each may have added their own layers, their own interpretations, their own marks. The result is not a singular narrative, but a palimpsest, a spiritual and cultural record, written, overwritten, and reinterpreted across generations. Modern indigenous communities often regard these carvings as sacred, even if the specific meanings have faded with time. Some believe the petroglyphs mark places of vision quest, initiation, or boundary. Others treat them as ancestral records, stories that don't need decoding by outsiders, only respect. And still, the mystery grows. Because for all their richness, the Kosos don't conform neatly to any single theory. The images are too varied, the contexts too diverse. Some figures are scratched in isolation, others crammed into dense narrative panels. You find repetition, but also contradiction. Symmetry, but also chaos. It's as if the rocks themselves became a kind of collective memory available to anyone who knew how to speak in stone. And the question that lingers: why here? Why this particular stretch of desert? Why so many images in such high concentration in a place that now seems so remote? One theory points to water. The Kosos lie near ancient springs and seasonal wetland sources of life in an otherwise harsh landscape. Another theory points to movement, the petroglyphs marking a convergence zone of trade routes, pilgrimage paths, and migratory patterns. Still, another suggests boundaries, the carvings declaring not just territory, but cosmological identity. Here is where we are. Here is who we are. Or were. Because the voices that made these carvings have largely gone quiet. What remains are the marks, the outlines of a worldview we can trace but not inhabit. And as you leave the canyon, the carvings at your back, a new question rises, not etched in stone, but carved into silence. What happens when the land itself used to be an island and the petroglyphs once surrounded a sacred lake? Because northward, high in the volcanic plateau, is a place where stone tells a different kind of story. Not hunting, not shamanism, but isolation. Thousands of carvings on a former island, now dry and crumbling. A place called Petroglyph Point, where meaning is layered as thick as the lava and just as hard to crack. Petroglyph Point, Lava Beds National Monument. There's something unnerving about petroglyphs when they're too quiet. Not just ancient, but isolated, removed, surrounded by nothing but sagebrush, basalt, and the memory of water. You stand at the base of a jagged cliff, at the edge of what used to be a lake, and you look up, and there they are. Thousands upon thousands of carvings, weathered and faint, crawling across the rock face in patterns you can't quite decipher. This is Petroglyph Point, part of the Lava Beds National Monument in far northeastern California. An ancient cliff that once stood as an island in the middle of Tule Lake, back when the surrounding basin was filled with glacial meltwater and marshes teeming with life. Now it's mostly dry, exposed, open, and brittle, but the petroglyphs remain. Etched into the soft volcanic tuff, they're unusually shallow, almost delicate. No dramatic hunting scenes here, no towering bighorn sheep or transforming shamans like in the Kosos. Instead, these are abstract motifs. Spirals, zigzags, ladder shapes, grids, nested circles, rows of dots. They crawl across the rock in dense clusters, layer upon layer, sometimes overlapping, sometimes in long horizontal bands, as if written in a script we were never meant to read. And here's the strange thing, there are over 5,000 of them. By some estimates, Petroglyph Point contains one of the largest collections of rock art in North America, but no one agrees on what they mean, or when, exactly, they were made. The carvings are attributed to ancestors of the Modoc people, whose territory encompassed the Tule Lake Basin and the surrounding volcanic highlands. For the Modoc, the cliffs and waters of this region were sacred sites of story, ritual, and origin. Petroglyph Point may have been a place of pilgrimage, a ceremonial site, a marker of connection between earth, sky, and water. But the specifics? Lost, or more accurately, held back, because these weren't meant for us. Archaeologists have tried to date the petroglyphs using indirect methods, tracking changes in lake levels, examining patina development, and comparing iconography to better dated sites. Estimates range broadly, from 6,000 to over 2,000 years ago, with some glyphs possibly more recent, but the lake itself complicates things. For much of the site's active period, Petroglyph Point was literally an island, accessible only by canoe or during periods of drought. That detail matters, because it means these carvings weren't made casually. You didn't just wander by with a chisel and make your mark. You had to travel here intentionally, repeatedly, with purpose. And then you had to carve into soft volcanic rock, risking erosion and exposure, to leave behind symbols that might last 1,000 years. So what was the message? Some believe the petroglyphs were a form of ritual record-keeping, a way to mark ceremonial attendance, seasonal events, or clan presence. Others suggest the glyphs served as spiritual tallies, recording dreams, visions, or agreements between people and spirits. The ladder-like shapes could represent portals or connections. The grids might be maps of land, of stars, of stories. The dots might be tallies, or prayers, or names. But there's a silence around the site that refuses to be solved by theory. No associated tools have been found nearby. No settlements, no burials, just the rock, the lake bed, and the carvings. It's as if the act of carving itself was the point, a ritual performance conducted in solitude, witnessed only by wind and water. Modern Modoc descendants often view the site as sacred, and understandably resist attempts to reduce its meaning to academic categories. This wasn't art. It wasn't decoration. It was communication with the unseen, a form of prayer in stone. But even sacred messages can get garbled over time, because erosion is erasing them. The soft tuff erodes faster than harder volcanic rock, and many glyphs are already faint, barely visible even with raking light photography. Others have been damaged by historical graffiti, bullet holes, and early preservation efforts that did more harm than good. The carvings are vanishing, pixel by pixel, into the indifferent wind. Which raises the question, what happens to a message when no one can read it anymore? Petroglyph Point forces us to confront the limits of archaeology. You can measure, catalog, and map every carving. You can compare symbols across sites. You can build typologies and models. But you can't reconstruct belief. Not fully. Not without stories. And that's what's missing here. The stories. The voices. The myths that once explained these lines. All that's left is the implication that someone, long ago, rode out to an island in the middle of a sacred lake, climbed a volcanic cliff, and began to carve, maybe for hours, maybe for days, a gesture not meant to impress, but to endure. And now, just a few hours south, near the foot of the Sierra Nevada, another site sits quietly under protection, its carvings weathered, its origin uncertain. Not on a former island, but in a desert corridor between ancient roots, a place where petroglyphs again resist translation, surrounded by silence and sun. It's called Fish Slough, and like Petroglyph Point, it speaks a language no one alive remembers. Fish Slough petroglyphs, Bishop. The desert doesn't scream. It murmurs, whispers through basalt canyons and alkaline flats, over dry stream beds and sun-cracked trails. And sometimes, when you're not expecting it, that whisper becomes something else. A mark on stone, deliberate and wordless, refusing to fade. Tucked in a remote stretch just north of Bishop, California, the Fish Slough petroglyphs rise out of the sagebrush like echoes from a forgotten ceremony. Not in grandeur, not in numbers, but in defiance. They exist where almost nothing else does, on ancient volcanic boulders in the high desert transition zone between the Owens Valley and the vast open basins of the Great Basin. No river runs past them now. But once, this land was wetter, busier, a crossroads. The petroglyphs, dozens of them, dot the landscape in loose, discontinuous clusters. Some are hidden beneath overhangs, others stand fully exposed. They're carved into volcanic tuff and basalt, mostly through pecking and incising, revealing lighter rock beneath the desert varnish. The figures range from geometric patterns to abstract motifs to anthropomorphic forms that feel just human enough to haunt. And, as always, no written record. No one alive today can say exactly what they mean. The area is now designated as an Area of Critical Environmental Concern, ACEC, by the Bureau of Land Management, recognized for its ecological sensitivity and its cultural importance. Tribal communities, archaeologists, and desert conservators all agree on one thing: this is a place that remembers, even if we don't. So what are we looking at? Like Petroglyph Point and the Kosos before it, the Fish Slough petroglyphs are characterized by symbolism over storytelling. You won't find mammoth hunts or elaborate myth scenes here. You'll find grids, spirals, cupules, those small, rounded depressions that appear in clusters, as if someone was tallying something without telling us what. Abstract patterns line up like staves of a musical score we've lost the ability to hear. And then there are the faces. Carved deep into the stone are several humanoid forms, broad eyes, rectangular bodies, fingers like tines, some with outstretched arms, others with limbs fused into shapes that don't quite belong to our taxonomy of known things. One figure appears to have antlers, another has a torso covered in hatch marks. They feel intentional, repeated, but their meanings float just out of reach. Are they guardians? Spirits? Shamans in animal form? Or are we projecting narrative onto a symbolic tradition that never needed our kind of logic? One recurring motif is the concentric circle, sometimes solitary, sometimes connected to lines or grids. These have been interpreted by some researchers as maps, solar or lunar symbols, portals, or even water markers. The last theory gains weight when you consider that Fish Slough sits on the edge of a desert wetland, an unusually lush strip of marshland, and springs nestled within the high desert. A place of biological richness in a region defined by dryness. That water was once far more abundant. Thousands of years ago, this area sat along transit routes used by indigenous peoples for seasonal migrations, trade, and spiritual journeys. Water would have made Fish Slough not just a rest stop, but a gathering place, perhaps even a ceremonial center. The carvings, then, could be ritual records, territorial markers, or astronomical reference points tied to solstices or seasonal events. Or they could be something less utilitarian art, as offering expression for its own sake, rooted in a worldview that saw no boundary between survival and spirituality. Modern Paiute Shoshone and other local native communities have deep ancestral ties to the region. Many recognize the sacredness of Fish Slough, even if the specific meanings of the petroglyphs have been obscured by colonial displacement and generational trauma. Oral traditions still whisper about spirit beings, star people, and places where the world thinned, where communication between realms was possible. Petroglyphs, in that context, were conversations, not illustrations. But those conversations have long been interrupted. Worse still, many petroglyphs at Fish Slough have suffered from vandalism, especially in the 20th century. Bullet holes, graffiti, and careless climbing have damaged panels that survived thousands of years of wind and rain. Even now, despite protective designations, the site remains vulnerable, caught in that uneasy space between recognition and neglect. So the carvings persist, not as relics, but as unresolved statements. Questions chiseled into a volcanic outcrop by people who understood something we've forgotten, that symbols don't need translation to carry weight, that some places are sacred because they were made sacred not by theology, but by repetition, by ritual, by presence. And presence lingers. You can feel it at Fish Slough. If you stand still long enough, the silence thickens, the wind flattens. You begin to see shapes in the stone that may or may not be real. You begin to wonder if this was less a place of answers and more a place of thresholds, where the land became language, where people etched the world they saw into a form that might survive the world they couldn't. And if that wasn't strange enough, just southwest on a wide-open plain lined with rolling hills, there's a place where those same symbols explode into color. A rock face splashed with polychrome images. Deer, humans, suns, snakes rendered not by carving but by painting, layered in reds, blacks, and yellows. A Chumash panel that's been called one of the most complex in the state. It's known simply as painted rock, and it doesn't whisper, it sings. Painted rock, Carrizo Plain. It rises like a forgotten cathedral. A sandstone amphitheater standing in the middle of the Carrizo Plain, dry and wind-blasted, framed by the San Andreas Fault to the east and the Temblor Range to the west. The land here doesn't just look ancient, it feels haunted by tectonic memory, like it remembers every continental shove and seismic twitch that ever pushed California into its current shape. And right at the heart of this shifting stage is a stone enclosure known as Painted Rock. From a distance, it's unremarkable. A crescent-shaped outcrop of rock, rounded and low, like a giant fossilized ribcage half buried in the dust. But as you approach and enter the central alcove, the illusion of simplicity evaporates. The sandstone walls inside are covered in red, black, and yellow ochre, layered in forms that defy casual explanation. This is not graffiti. This is not decoration. This is Chumash rock art among the most intricate and symbolically dense in California. And the fact that it survived at all, exposed to the elements and the whims of humans, is a kind of miracle. But like so many prehistoric mysteries in California, Painted Rock raises more questions than it answers. What do the images mean? Who painted them? And when? And perhaps most unsettling, what were they for? Let's begin with the basics. Painted Rock's central alcove, sometimes called the Inner Sanctuary, contains a polychrome mural, once vibrant, now faded, but still potent. Anthropomorphic figures, sunbursts, snakes, circles, zigzags, some simple, others wildly complex. There are layered overpaintings, suggesting the site was revisited, revised, reimagined over generations. And although erosion and vandalism have erased parts of the imagery, enough survives to hint at its former richness. This was not art in the way we think of it. There are no landscapes, no scenes of daily life. Instead, it's symbolic, possibly cosmological. Some researchers argue the images represent a kind of Chumash sacred geography, encoded in color and shape. Others see shamanic symbolism visionary records made by ritual specialists during altered states of consciousness. The figures, in this view, are not meant to be literal, but experiential. Journeys, transformations, encounters. One motif appears repeatedly: a circle with rays or appendages, possibly the sun, or possibly something else entirely. Some interpret it as a world center, a symbolic axis mundi connecting earth and sky. Other shapes resemble snakes or serpentine lines, sometimes with dots or cross-hatching. These could be rivers, energy paths, lightning spiritual currents, but again, we don't know. Every attempt at translation comes with the same asterisk, subject to enormous uncertainty. Dating the images is equally murky. Because the paints used are mineral-based and applied directly onto porous sandstone, radiocarbon dating is mostly ineffective. The most confident estimates place the murals at somewhere between 800 to 1,200 years old, but some elements could be older. What's certain is that the site was important long before the Spanish arrived. The Chumash and other tribes maintained oral traditions about the location, and later ethnographic records collected in the 19th and early 20th centuries reference Painted Rock as a ceremonial site. The Carrizo Plain itself was a boundary zone, a transitional region between Chumash, Yokuts, and Salinan territories. Painted Rock may have served as a neutral ceremonial gathering point or a place of intertribal convergence. It wasn't a village. No signs of long-term habitation exist. But temporary camps, ritual use, and astronomical observation? All possibilities. In fact, some have proposed astronomical alignments within the rock formation itself. During solstices and equinoxes, light filters into the alcove in ways that suggest intentional design, or at least intentional use of the natural topography. It's tempting to imagine shamans or ritual leaders waiting for the sun to strike a particular symbol, marking time not with clocks, but with shadow and pigment. But if that was once known, it's now lost. What makes Painted Rock even more tragic and more compelling is what has already vanished. In the 20th century, extensive vandalism and amateur restoration attempts damaged much of the imagery. Visitors carved their names over sacred symbols. Others took pieces of the wall or repainted sections with good intentions and bad information. Today, large sections are irreparably altered. And so, what remains is a half-erased text, sacred to some, misunderstood by most. For the Chumash and their descendants, Painted Rock is still alive. It's part of a larger, enduring cosmology tied to the land, the sky, and the stories that link the two. Even without the full meanings, the site holds power, emotional, spiritual, ancestral. The symbols aren't dead, they're just quiet, waiting. And just down the coast, tucked into a cool sandstone cave near Santa Barbara, another Chumash painting glows beneath layers of soot and time. It's smaller, darker, more protected, but no less mysterious. Some say it records a 1,677 eclipse. Others say it maps the sky of the soul. It's called Chumash Painted Cave, and the light in there doesn't move like it does outside. It bends, it flickers, it speaks in color and silence. Chumash Painted Cave, Santa Barbara County. High above Santa Barbara, where the chaparral curls over sandstone cliffs and the Pacific glints faintly through the trees, there's a small cave carved into the mountainside. Blink, and you'll drive right past it. No sweeping views, no dramatic signage. Just a gated mouth in the rock, barely tall enough to stand in, tucked beneath the overhang of a ridge that watches the coast from above. This is Chumash Painted Cave, and it contains one of the most vividly preserved examples of native Californian rock art in the state. What it lacks in size, it makes up for in density, a kaleidoscope of red, black, yellow, and white pigments painted in precise geometries and layered symbols. And unlike the sprawling, sun-beaten petroglyph fields of the desert, this is an interior world, dark, still, protected, a sanctuary of color, surrounded by silence. Step inside, and you're met with a kind of visual symphony. Concentric circles ripple outward like echoes. Starbursts, dots, spirals, and cross-hatching cover nearly every surface of the small cave's inner dome. The ceiling feels impossibly close, like you're inside a thought, not a space. And every inch is marked with something that looks like meaning. But again, what kind of meaning? Some researchers have proposed that the artwork here may depict an eclipse, possibly the solar eclipse of the 24th of November 1677, which was visible in this part of California. There's a particular red and black circle radiating with spokes that some interpret as a symbolic sun being devoured. Other scholars are more cautious. They point out that Chumash cosmology doesn't necessarily divide the celestial from the spiritual. An eclipse may have been important, yes, but not merely as an astronomical event. It could have signaled a rift, a transition, a moment where the sky's usual order bent inward. This kind of ambiguity defines Painted Cave. No single image dominates. There are at least 36 distinct elements, each painted with clear intent but now hovering without translation. Unlike carvings or petroglyphs, which rely on shadow and depth, these paintings glow, or they used to. Many are now faded from soot, weathering, and time. Even so, their arrangement suggests narrative, sequence, repetition, a visual language. Who painted them? Most scholars attribute the work to the Chumash, specifically their spiritual practitioners, shamans, or ritual specialists who worked between worlds. In Chumash belief, the cosmos was layered, an upper world of stars and sky beings, a middle world of humans and animals, and a lower world of serpents, death, and transformation. Caves, in this worldview, were thresholds, places where those worlds touched. Which means this cave wasn't art for art's sake. It was a tool, a ceremonial chamber, a stage for vision quests, trance states, healing rites, or sky mapping ceremonies. The pigments used red from iron oxide, black from charcoal or manganese, white from crushed shell or gypsum were carefully chosen and likely mixed with ritual binders like plant oils or blood. Every brushstroke was an act of invocation. And yet, no oral tradition survives to explain exactly what each symbol means. The Spanish colonizers who arrived in the 18th century did not preserve these cosmologies. They dismantled them. What we have now is reconstruction, careful analysis, respectful speculation, but no certainty. One thing we do know, the cave's survival is exceptional. While many Chumash rock art sites have been eroded, vandalized, or lost, this one remains intact, albeit behind a steel grate, installed in the 20th century to prevent further damage. The gate protects, but it also distances. You can't step inside. You can only peer through the bars at a world that's barely still visible, already fading. But the light still moves strangely in there. During certain times of day, sun rays filter through the cracks and strike the walls just so illuminating specific patterns, then receding again. It feels intentional, like someone long ago choreographed the light itself. And that idea that light and shadow were part of the ritual experience takes us to another painted cave just 60 miles southeast. This one's even more secretive. Tucked into the hills above the modern sprawl of Simi Valley, it's closed to the public, hidden behind fences and federal facilities. Yet within it, a rumor has persisted for decades. A beam of sunlight striking a painted panel on the winter solstice. Coincidence? Or a prehistoric calendar made of pigment, stone, and light? This is Burro Flats Painted Cave, and it's the next mystery in the chain. If Chumash Painted Cave is a quiet dialogue with the stars, Burro Flats may be the moment when the stars answer back. Burro Flats Painted Cave, Simi Hills. It's the most protected painted cave in California, and possibly the most mysterious. Located in the Simi Hills, hidden inside a sandstone overhang near the Santa Susana Pass, Burro Flats Painted Cave is not open to the public. It's behind locked gates on federal land, surrounded by what was once the rocket-dying Santa Susana Field Laboratory, a Cold War-era aerospace testing site with a long and controversial environmental legacy. The irony is almost poetic. Ancient cosmology, in the shadow of modern science, both watching the sky, both whispering about fire. Inside the cave, on a panel just above eye level, is one of the most beautifully preserved Chumash polychrome murals ever found. Like Chumash Painted Cave, it features red, black, white, and yellow pigments. The figures are stylized, abstract, rhythmic, circles, rays, anthropomorphic beings, ladder shapes. And then, the focal point, a complex circular motif some have interpreted as a solar symbol. But what sets Burro Flats apart isn't just the artwork, it's what the light does. According to multiple ethnographers, archaeologists, and indigenous consultants, the cave is believed to include a winter solstice alignment. On the morning of the solstice, as the sun rises over the eastern hills, a narrow beam of light enters the cave and strikes the central motif, illuminating it precisely. It's the kind of alignment you don't stumble into. It suggests planning, awareness, repeat observation over many years, a ceremonial calendar not carved in stone, but animated by it. And if intentional, it places the Chumash among the many ancient cultures, Maya, ancestral Puebloans, Neolithic Europeans who built rituals around the movement of the sun. But not everyone agrees it was deliberate. Some skeptics suggest the solstice alignment might be coincidental, a lucky accident of topography. Others argue the cave's visibility to the solstice light is real, but the meaning assigned to it is a modern romantic overlay. Without textual records, it's hard to confirm either way. Still, for the Chumash and many of their descendants, the site's importance doesn't hinge on outsider validation. The symbols painted inside are a live part of a cosmological tradition that sees land, sky, and time as intertwined. The solstice isn't just an astronomical event. It's a moment of rebirth, of alignment between human and celestial worlds. And there's more to the mystery. Burro Flats is unique among painted caves in how well it's been preserved, not because it was venerated, but because it was locked away. Its inaccessibility, first due to private land ownership, later due to the federal laboratory, has ironically protected it from the vandalism and weathering that have degraded so many other sites. But that secrecy has also kept it largely out of public knowledge. Few photos exist, fewer still have stood in its presence. Tribal groups, particularly the Fernandino Tataviam Band of Mission Indians and the Santa Ynez Band of Chumash Indians, have petitioned for the site's return. They want to see the cave repatriated, removed from federal oversight, and placed under tribal stewardship. For them, this isn't just a cultural resource. It's a living place, a sacred site still tethered to seasonal cycles and ancestral memory. The negotiation is ongoing. In the meantime, the cave waits. The light still finds its way in once a year, whether anyone watches or not. The paint still clings to the rock, whether or not we can interpret it. And the message, whatever it was, remains suspended in time, protected not by understanding, but by distance. And somewhere, just across the Los Angeles basin, the bones of a woman rest in asphalt. Trapped in the same tar that swallowed dire wolves and saber-toothed cats, she was once human, once alive, once part of something larger. They call her Brea Woman, and her story is as sticky as the place she was found. Brea Woman, Los Angeles. In the middle of Los Angeles, just off Wilshire Boulevard, mammoths die in the shadow of a Forever 21. The La Brea tar pits are one of the most famous fossil sites in the world, an Ice Age graveyard that's been slowly swallowing bones for tens of thousands of years. Saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, ancient bison, giant ground sloths, all preserved in pools of sticky asphalt that bubbled up from deep beneath the surface, trapping anything unlucky enough to wander too close. It's a place where time is less a line and more a loop of preservation, death perfectly stored. And among the tens of thousands of animals recovered from this accidental trap, there is one skeleton that has refused to be explained away: La Brea Woman. Discovered in 1914, her remains were unearthed by excavation crews during one of the earliest digs at the tar pits. The find included a partial human skeleton, primarily a skull and scattered bones alongside the remains of a domesticated dog located nearby. The bones were roughly 10,000 years old, dating to the end of the Pleistocene, and that, at first glance, was extraordinary enough. This would make her one of the oldest known human remains from Southern California. But the questions began almost immediately. The first reports suggested she was between 18 and 25 years old at the time of her death. Some early interpretations claimed she had suffered cranial trauma, leading to lurid speculation that she'd been killed, murdered, and thrown into the tar. Others pointed to the dog as evidence of burial ritual, perhaps an early companion animal laid to rest alongside its human. The entire scene seemed rich with meaning, dramatic, poetic even, until the evidence started to unravel. For one thing, the trauma theory was largely debunked. Later analyses revealed that the skull fractures were more consistent with damage from excavation equipment or even the pressure of the asphalt over time rather than violence. The idea that she was murdered and discarded was more the product of early 20th century sensationalism than solid science. The dog? Also complicated. While it was initially interpreted as possibly part of a burial, further examination cast doubt on whether it was even associated with the human remains at all. It may have simply been another tar pit victim, deposited thousands of years apart and brought together by the sticky, geological blender that is La Brea. And then came the biggest blow to the mystery: context. La Brea Woman was found out of stratigraphic context, meaning the precise layer in which she was buried wasn't clearly recorded. The early excavation practices at the site lacked today's standards of documentation. Which layer, which date, which nearby fossils? Unclear. Without context, everything becomes tentative. Interpretations get wobbly. And yet, the questions haven't gone away. Her age is still remarkable, dating to around 9,000, 10,000 years before present, and her presence in a tar pit full of Ice Age fauna invites speculation, even if much of it is necessarily cautious. Was she deliberately buried there? Did she die nearby and somehow become entangled in the asphalt later? Was this a sacred site to early peoples or just an unfortunate accident? No one knows for sure. What we do know is that her bones were once displayed at the George C. Page Museum in a glass case beside the great predators and giants of the past. Visitors would walk by her and stare into the face of deep time, not a saber-tooth, but a person. A woman who lived and died long before this land became a city, long before the Spanish missions, long before even the Chumash and Tongva histories we can still trace today. But even that ended. In the 2000 seconds, after consultation with Native American communities and a growing recognition of ethical concerns, La Brea Woman was removed from display. Today, her remains are stored in a secure repository, no longer on public view, pending further consultation and repatriation discussions. The mystery, however, remains on display largely because it never relied on the bones alone. It lives in the gap between explanation and implication, between what was once thought to be certain and what is now understood to be unknowable, because she's not just a person, she's a symbol of our desire to find stories where maybe there are none, of our compulsion to connect dots that don't line up. of the way prehistoric California still refuses to be neatly filed under solved. And speaking of unsolved, let's widen the frame. Because if Brea Woman is the human face of the Pleistocene, then the animals she was buried with or near are its vanishing chorus. Mammoths, saber-tooths, camels, giant sloths, dire wolves, all gone. And while Brea preserved their bones, it didn't preserve the reason why they vanished. Was it climate? Was it humans? Or was it something else entirely? That's the next mystery one the bones haven't stopped asking. Why did so many big animals vanish at Brea? The fossil record of Brea is a monument to absence. More than 3.5 million individual bones have been recovered from the tar pit since excavation began, a staggering catalog of Pleistocene life. Lions with American passports, wolves with double the bite force of modern breeds, condors with wingspans that eclipse the sky, camels in California, horses in the Hollywood Hills, giant sloths that reared up like living backhoes, mammoths, mastodons, bears the size of sedans. And then, suddenly, about 11,000 years ago they were gone. It's called the Late Pleistocene extinction, and it wasn't just a California problem. Across the Americas and, in fact, across the planet, a significant percentage of large-bodied mammals disappeared in a geological blink. In North America, over 70% of megafaunal species vanished around the end of the last ice age. But Brea offers one of the most concentrated, best-preserved records of this collapse. So if any site should hold answers, it's this one. Theories abound, but none fit comfortably. The climate change model points to the dramatic warming period at the end of the Pleistocene. Melting glaciers, shifting biomes, shrinking grasslands, rising sea levels, all of which would have destabilized ecosystems and pressured species already walking the knife's edge of survival. It's a tidy theory, but it doesn't explain why only the large animals vanished, while smaller ones, rabbits, coyotes, skunks, and squirrels persisted. Then there's the human overkill hypothesis. Proposed in the mid-20th century, it suggests that newly arrived human populations hunted megafauna to extinction in a matter of centuries. The logic? Large animals are slow to reproduce and easy targets. Once humans entered the ecosystem with coordinated hunting strategies, it was a short walk to annihilation. There's evidence of human megafauna interaction in other parts of North America, including kill sites with butchered bones and Clovis points. But not at Brea. No mass kill sites, no obvious signs of weapon-inflicted trauma, no flint points embedded in ribs. The tar preserved the bones, but not the battles if they ever happened. A more recent idea blends the two, a synergy hypothesis, where changing climate created ecological stress and human predation pushed already fragile species over the edge. This Goldilocks theory is attractive, neither too hot nor too accusatory, but still lacks conclusive proof. Then there's the wildcard theory, disease. A pathogen introduced by humans or other migrating species could have ripped through naive megafauna populations with no immunity. It sounds speculative, and it is, but pandemics have played roles in mass die-offs before. It's plausible, it's chilling, and like the rest, it's unproven. What Brea gives us is not a cause but a record, a time capsule, a before and after with no middle. All of the players perfectly preserved in asphalt, all of the exits still unexplained. Why did the saber-tooth vanish while the mountain lion survived? Why did horses disappear from North America entirely, only to be reintroduced by the Spanish 10,000 years later? Why did mammoths die out here, but survive on isolated Arctic islands for another 5,000 years? We don't know, and maybe that's the point. The extinction at Brea is not just a question of what died, it's a question of what remains when explanation fails, what we inherit from a silence too large to fill. And that silence extends beyond bones and into the soil. In the shadow of San Francisco's skyline, under layers of urban development, ancient shellmounds rise up not in bone, but in shell and ritual. They are not graves, exactly. Not villages, exactly, but something in between. Ritual, midden, monument, a city of the dead beneath a city of the living. We call them the San Francisco Bay shellmounds, and their purpose is still debated. San Francisco Bay shellmounds, including Emeryville. They used to be everywhere. Rising like low hills across the flatlands of the San Francisco Bay, shell mounds once dotted the landscape from what is now Vallejo to Fremont, from Sausalito to the Oakland estuary. By the time European settlers arrived in the 18th and 19th centuries, there were hundreds of them, some so large that they were mistaken for natural formations. Others were quarried for construction, fill, fertilizer, or simply flattened to make room for factories, railroads, and shopping centers. And in one of the most staggering losses in California prehistory, nearly all of them are now gone. But what were they, really? The term shell mound implies a pile of shells. And yes, they contain thousands, millions of clam, mussel, oyster, and snail shells, layered together with bone fragments, charcoal, ash, tools, beads, and the occasional human burial. But to reduce them to that is to miss the point. These weren't just garbage heaps. They weren't just burial sites. They weren't just settlements. They were all of those things, and possibly more. Take the Emeryville shell mound, once the largest and most famous in the region. Located at the edge of what is now a sprawling mall complex, it rose at least 60 feet high and stretched over 300 feet in diameter. Early excavations in the early 20th century, hastily done, poorly recorded, revealed a complex interior, dense shell layers, numerous burials, ceremonial objects, tools, and evidence of prolonged habitation. The Ohlone people, whose ancestors built it, had occupied the region for thousands of years, and the mound may have served as both village center and ceremonial site. One interpretation views the shell mounds as living monuments, multifunctional sites that evolved over time. A place where people lived, cooked, buried their dead, held ceremonies, and returned again and again across generations. Others suggest they were more sacred than domestic, used primarily for mortuary rites and ceremonial gatherings, where shell deposits symbolized spiritual wealth and connection to the waters that sustained them. But here's where things get messy. Modern archaeology still can't agree. Were these chiefly villages with incidental burials, or were they cemeteries that occasionally housed the living? Were they neutral zones, shared ceremonial grounds for multiple groups, or the spiritual core of one tribe's territory? Interpretations differ not only by discipline but by decade. And while academic debates continue, the mounds themselves have quietly disappeared. Emeryville's was leveled in the early 1900 seconds to make way for an amusement park. Later, a paint factory. Now, a mall. The site is marked by a sculpture that vaguely gestures toward its past, but the actual mound is gone, excavated, bulldozed, erased. Other shell mounds met similar fates. A few were documented in salvage archaeology reports. Most were simply scraped into silence. Today, only a handful remain in semi-intact form, and they are almost all off-limits to the public or buried under parking lots, highways, and buildings. Meanwhile, native communities, particularly the Ohlone, continue to advocate for their recognition, preservation, and protection. The tragedy is that we may never fully understand their function because the evidence has been scattered, disrespected, or removed. But one thing is clear: the shell mounds were not accidents. They were deliberate, structured, culturally rich. They were memory, encoded in landscape. And they raise a difficult question. When an entire cosmology is built into a hill of shells, what happens when you pave it over? Is it still sacred if no one knows it's there? The silence of the mounds now echoes into another set of hills, where archaeologists once identified a mysterious cultural pattern, early, mobile, and hard to classify. No shell mounds, no polychrome caves, just stone tools, grinding slabs, and a way of life that doesn't fit the typical timeline. They call it the Topanga culture, and its origins are still unclear. Topanga culture, Santa Monica Mountains. It doesn't have the brand recognition of Clovis or the romantic allure of the Chumash maritime legacy. It doesn't feature dramatic rock art, flashy obsidian spear points, or famous burial sites. What it has is stone, plain, utilitarian, and stubbornly enigmatic. The so-called Topanga culture is named after the rugged canyons and oak-studded ridges of the Santa Monica Mountains, particularly around Topanga Canyon, northwest of Los Angeles. Archaeologists coined the term in the mid-20th century to describe a cluster of early and middle Holocene archaeological sites that didn't quite fit existing typologies. What emerged was a cultural pattern marked by groundstone tools, manos, metates, and milling slabs. These people were heavily engaged in plant processing acorns, seeds, perhaps roots and tubers. There are projectile points, but they're often crude. Choppers, scrapers, and hammerstones dominate the toolkit. Compared to the elegant barbed points of the Channel Islands or the fine obsidian of the interior, Topanga tools seem blunt, unadorned, but what they lack in flash, they make up for in mystery. Dating from approximately 9,000 to 3,000 years ago, the Topanga culture spans a huge chunk of prehistory. Sites are scattered across the hills, ridgelines, and uplands, often away from rivers or coastlines, suggesting a semi-mobile upland adaptation. These were not coastal fishers or desert traders. They were foragers and grinders, moving through oak woodlands and sagebrush scrub, harvesting seasonal foods and possibly managing plant resources in ways we're only beginning to understand. And here's where things get complicated. Despite decades of research, archaeologists still struggle to determine where the Topanga people came from and who, if anyone, they became. Did they descend from earlier Paleo-Indian groups who adapted to a warmer, drier climate? Did they emerge independently as a localized response to post-Pleistocene environments? Or were they the ancestors of later, more recognizable cultures in the region, Gabrielino Tongva, Tataviam, Chumash? There are no definitive answers, only a trail of clues. At many Topanga sites, stratigraphy suggests a gradual evolution. Stone tools become smaller, grinding technology becomes more refined, points shift from large dart tips to smaller arrowheads. This implies cultural continuity. But continuity with what? Some scholars argue the Topanga pattern overlaps with broader Western archaic traditions stretching across the Great Basin and the Southwest. Others insist it's distinctly Californian, shaped by the unique ecology of the coast and coastal ranges. The truth may lie somewhere in between, a hybrid zone of ideas, techniques, and traditions passed through generations like songs with forgotten verses. Even the subsistence strategies remain debated. While grinding tools dominate the sites, we don't have clear evidence of storage pits, granaries, or the kind of settled life that often accompanies acorn economies. Were these people semi-sedentary, tethered to groves and grinding slabs? Or were they highly mobile, moving in seasonal rounds, adapting to scarcity with flexible know-how? The archaeology doesn't provide easy answers. Sites are often shallow, disturbed, or incomplete. Bone rarely preserves well in the acidic soils of the Santa Monica Mountains. Organic materials, wood, fiber, hide, are almost entirely gone. Which leaves us with the stone. And stone, for all its endurance, doesn't talk back. It doesn't explain why these people stayed upland while others hugged the coast. It doesn't clarify whether Topanga was a culture, a toolkit, a phase, or just a convenient label slapped onto our own confusion. What it does is stand there, gritty, worn, and unmistakably shaped by human hands. The Topanga culture is a story told in missing pages, and the next page doesn't clarify the picture, it complicates it. Far to the north, in a volcanic basin lined with obsidian flows and Paleo-Indian promise, another site breaks the narrative open. a place called Borax Lake, where ancient points shimmer in strange shapes and older questions refuse to die. Borax Lake Site, Lake County. To find the Borax Lake Site, you have to know where to look and be willing to chase ghosts through heat-blurred sage and ancient obsidian flows. Tucked away near the town of Clear Lake in Lake County, Northern California, it doesn't look like much. A shallow, alkaline lake ringed by low ridges and dusty soil. But beneath this modest surface lies one of the oldest, most enigmatic archaeological sites in the western United States. And like so many prehistoric puzzles, Borax Lake refuses to tell its story cleanly. Discovered in the 1930 seconds by amateur archaeologist Chester Post, the site quickly gained notoriety for its depth and its age. Buried beneath layers of volcanic ash and sediment were stone projectile points. Not just any points, but large, stemmed, expertly flaked specimens that bore more than a passing resemblance to both Clovis and the so-called Western stemmed tradition. Radiocarbon dates and stratigraphic analysis later suggested an astonishing timeline. Human occupation here may go back as far as 12,000, 14,000 years ago, possibly even older. This places Borax Lake firmly in the Paleo-Indian period, during or just after the final retreat of the glaciers that had once defined the continent. In short, Borax Lake shouldn't be here, or at least not in the way it island. The mystery begins with the points themselves. The Borax Lake style is a blend of attributes. Some are large, lanceolate blades long and leaf-shaped, with well-crafted edges. Others are narrower, stemmed, and more typical of early Holocene toolkits found in the Great Basin. The site seems to exist at a cultural crossroads, where point styles blend and contradict, suggesting either cultural overlap, rapid evolution, or something entirely different. And then there's the context. The site sits on an ancient lakeshore, part of a high desert ecosystem that was once teeming with freshwater, waterfowl, and big game. The surrounding obsidian fields provided the raw material for tools, and the environmental setting was ideal for temporary encampments. But here's the kicker. While the points are old, bone preservation is poor, and organic materials are rare. There's almost no direct evidence of what the people ate, how they lived, or even how long they stayed. We have the tools, but not the hands that held them. So who were they? Some researchers have proposed that the Borax Lake people were part of a coastal migration, early seafarers who moved north and inland, leaving behind traces of stemmed tools as they adapted to different environments. Others argue the site represents a Paleo-Indian inland push, a group related to the Clovis tradition that moved westward, carrying with them a distinctive lithic tradition that hybridized with local innovations. And still others ask whether we're looking at a third strand entirely a separate migration, unrelated to either Clovis or coastal groups, whose toolkit reflects a parallel development lost in the archaeological noise of erosion, volcanic activity, and time. Complicating the matter is that Borax Lake's early excavations were not up to modern standards. Some artifacts were recovered without precise stratigraphic data, and the original dig notes are inconsistent. Later efforts to redate the site and analyze the stratigraphy more rigorously have helped, but uncertainty still hangs over the earliest layers. Despite this, Borax Lake remains a touchstone in debates about the peopling of the Americas. Because if people were here tooling obsidian, hunting by the lakeshore, crafting lanceolate blades at the same time others were supposedly just crossing into the continent from Siberia, then everything we thought we knew about first migrations gets scrambled. Again. The site demands we entertain uncomfortable possibilities, that multiple groups arrived at different times, that technological traditions emerged independently, that ancient California had more cultural complexity than we're currently able to see. And speaking of complexity, look south toward the deserts of Coachella and Imperial counties. Scattered along the shores of a now-vanished lake are stone fish traps, carefully arranged, suggestive of ownership, coordination, and knowledge passed across generations. Their story isn't about projectile points. It's about infrastructure and a vanishing body of water that once fed a civilization. Lake Cahuilla fish traps, Coachella divided by Imperial. At first glance, they look like nothing more than lines of rocks low, crumbling walls that snake along the desert floor. They rise and fall with no obvious pattern, some forming semicircular pens, others creating sinuous channels, half swallowed by sand. You might miss them entirely, unless someone told you to look. But once you do, the shapes become unmistakable. These are fish traps, and they're not accidents. Scattered along the now dry shorelines of the ancient Lake Cahuilla, these stone features stretch across parts of Coachella and Imperial valleys, relics of a time when this desert was filled not with subdivisions and golf courses, but with water, a massive freshwater lake covering over 2,000 square miles. At its peak, Lake Cahuilla was larger than the entire modern Salton Sea, reaching from present-day Palm Springs to the Mexican border. And people lived on its shores. The lake formed periodically over the last several thousand years, when the Colorado River overflowed its banks and redirected its flow into the Salton Basin. Each time the river shifted accidentally or intentionally, a new lake would bloom, thrive, and then evaporate, leaving behind salt flats, marshes, and memories. Some of these lake cycles lasted centuries, others mere decades. But during its wet periods, Lake Cahuilla would have been a rich ecosystem, teeming with fish, birds, and edible plants. Enter the fish traps. Constructed from local stone and positioned strategically along ancient shorelines and channels, these structures would have been used to funnel, corral, or hold fish, particularly tilapia and desert pupfish, but possibly other species depending on the lake's composition during its various incarnations. Some traps were built like weirs walls to guide fish into shallow enclosures where they could be caught with baskets or spears. Others formed holding ponds, allowing fish to be stored alive and harvested gradually. This wasn't casual fishing. This was organized, seasonal, and planned. But by whom? The fish traps are generally attributed to the ancestors of the Kumeyaay, Cahuilla, and Quechan peoples' tribes, whose oral traditions and archaeological footprints circle the lakebed. But the question of when the traps were built is surprisingly difficult to answer. Some may be as old as 2,000 years, others as recent as 500 years ago. Without organic materials preserved within the structures, radiocarbon dating is tricky. And the traps themselves, being built of unmodified stones, don't offer easy clues. They don't announce their makers. They just sit there, hinting at a logistical culture, a people deeply familiar with seasonal rhythms, hydrology, and ecological balance. Even more intriguingly, the sheer number and scale of fish traps in certain areas suggest collective labor. These weren't the work of lone individuals, but likely coordinated by family groups, clans, or entire villages. The knowledge required to build and maintain them would have been handed down, refined, and adapted with each lake cycle. And yet, they're almost completely unrecognized. Today, many of the fish traps are unmarked, unfenced, and slowly disintegrating. Some are buried beneath sand. Others are threatened by off-road vehicles, development, and agricultural expansion. A few are visible only from aerial photography shapes in the landscape that disappear at ground level. The deeper mystery is what these traps meant to the people who built them. Were they just tools? Or did they represent territorial rights, ritual obligations, or even clan identity? Did the fish themselves feature in cosmological stories? Or were they simply sustenance in a hard land? No one knows. But we can say this: the fish traps were part of a larger infrastructure of survival, one that included water knowledge, social cooperation, and a relationship with a lake that kept appearing and vanishing like a mirage with memory. And further east, scattered across other parts of the desert, are circles of stone that seem less functional and more symbolic rock rings, cleared areas, enigmatic formations with unclear purposes. They don't trap fish, they don't store water, but they do speak if only in riddles. We call them desert-cleared circles, and they mark the next threshold in the unexplained. Desert-cleared circles and rock rings, Anza-Borrego divided by Mojave. Scattered across the sun-seared floors of Anza-Borrego, the Mojave Desert, and parts of the southern Great Basin are strange, subtle features that don't advertise themselves. No towering carvings, no painted walls, no monumental architecture, just stone circles, cleared patches of ground, and oddly geometric arrangements of rock blink and they vanish. Step too close, and their outlines collapse into randomness. And yet, if you step back, if you look from above, or if you approach them with patience, the patterns emerge. These are California's desert-cleared circles and rock rings, and they are among the most understated yet persistent enigmas in the prehistoric landscape. Found in some of the harshest, driest, and least forgiving environments in the state, they've often been dismissed as camping debris, natural formations, or colonial period sheep corrals. But many are far older and far more intentional. So what are they? At the most basic level, cleared circles are just that, areas where the natural desert surface rocks, vegetation, crust has been removed, revealing lighter soil beneath. Often, a ring of stones remains at the perimeter, suggesting not randomness, but design. Some circles are only a few feet wide, others span 20 feet or more. Some are solitary, others appear in clusters or lines, often near ancient trails, water sources, or rock art panels. In certain cases, they are surrounded by smaller features, stone alignments, cairns, or hearth-like depressions, suggesting extended use or ritual significance, but their function remains elusive. Some archaeologists argue these are sleeping circles, places where travelers, hunters, or small groups cleared the ground to rest for the night, surrounding themselves with rocks to insulate or secure the area. Others see them as tent bases, the stone rings anchoring the edges of brush or hide shelters. This is plausible and supported by ethnographic accounts from indigenous desert peoples like the Cahuilla, Kumeyaay, and Chemehuevi, who spoke of such temporary structures in the oral record. But not all the features fit the sleeping circle mold. Some are simply too large, too geometrically consistent, or too isolated to be explained away as campsites. And many show no evidence of domestic use, no fire-cracked rock, no tool debris, no food waste, just space, defined, marked, but empty. This has led others to propose a ceremonial or symbolic function. Could some of these cleared areas have been ritual spaces, dance circles, offering sites, or even astronomical markers aligned with solstices or cardinal directions? Some formations appear to align with surrounding landscape features, ridges, sunrises, prominent peaks, suggesting at least some degree of cosmic orientation. And then there's the hypothesis that they were trail markers, part of a visual or mnemonic landscape used to guide travelers across a desolate terrain. When water is life and trails mean survival, even the most minimal marks can take on immense importance. But that only deepens the mystery. Why circles? Why rock rings? Why do these patterns repeat across hundreds of miles among peoples who may have had different languages, traditions, and technologies? One possibility is that the circle itself holds a symbolic meaning across many indigenous cosmologies. In many native Californian traditions, the circle represents continuity, balance, cycles, and the cosmos itself. Whether in basket patterns, dance formations, or the layout of sacred spaces, the circular form often reflects a worldview deeply rooted in reciprocity and seasonal flow. Still, assigning meaning is difficult. Very few of these features have been formally excavated, and many are found in remote, minimally disturbed areas, making them both a gift and a challenge to researchers. They sit in archaeological limbo, neither fully explored nor officially classified. Local indigenous groups often recognize these features as sacred spaces, even if the original purpose is no longer remembered. Their cultural value remains independent of scientific explanation. They are part of a storied landscape, one where memory is carried by stone and gesture rather than text. And even as archaeologists debate sleeping circles versus ceremonial sites, the rings themselves remain defiant, underanalyzed, persistent. But just offshore, on the Channel Islands, another mystery lingers, one made not of circles, but of fibers, fragile, early, technologically advanced. A glimpse into the textile traditions of a seafaring people who wove their world before most of it sank beneath the sea. That mystery is island basketry and early fiber technology, and it may be one of the oldest forms of memory still surviving in thread. Island basketry and early fiber technology, Northern Channel Islands. If stone speaks slowly, then fiber whispers even more softly, and for it to survive, the conditions have to be nearly perfect. Dry, sheltered, undisturbed for thousands of years, which is exactly what the caves of the Northern Channel Islands provided. Tucked into the windswept bluffs of Santa Rosa, San Miguel, and Santa Cruz Islands, archaeologists have discovered something astonishing: the earliest evidence of basketry and cordage in North America. Not recent, not rustic, but ancient, fragile, and technically advanced. We're talking about woven fibers dating back over 10,000 years, possibly as old as 12,000 years, depending on which cave and which layer you're looking at. These aren't primitive lumpy coils. They're finely spun, twisted, and knotted. Some show patterns. Others are fragments of larger items, baskets, nets, mats, lines. These artifacts suggest not only daily use, but cultural continuity and specialization. And yet, until recently, this part of California's prehistoric record was deeply underappreciated. In most narratives about early human migration into the Americas, the focus falls on hunting, Clovis points, mammoth bones, kill sites. But here, on these islands, we see a different emphasis. A maritime economy, a foraging strategy, a toolkit that includes not just stone points, but fiber, tools, nets for fish, ropes for boats, mats for shelters, baskets for storing seeds and goods. This is technology designed not for conquest, but for containment, collection, and complexity. One of the most significant finds came from Daisy Cave on San Miguel Island, where archaeologists uncovered cordage made from plant fibers, carefully twisted into 2-ply strands. These fragments were buried alongside shellfish remains, bird bones, and stone tools, creating a multi-dimensional snapshot of early coastal lifeways. And the implications are massive. Cordage and basketry don't survive often, especially in damp or open-air environments, so the fact that we find them at all suggests they were not rare or experimental. They were common, essential, widespread. You don't just invent rope once, you inherit the skill, you pass it down. The presence of early fiber technology implies generations of learning and specialized labor, perhaps even gendered roles in production and use. The materials themselves, likely native plants such as tule, milkweed, juncus, and possibly coastal agave, had to be harvested, processed, softened, and twisted using techniques that leave almost no trace except the finished product. This is invisible labor, the kind that often escapes the archaeological record. And yet here it is, preserved in cave strata, older than the pyramids, whispering from its fibers. Some researchers argue that the presence of basketry and cordage this early supports the idea of a coastal migration route into the Americas. After all, if the first peoples had boats or even simple rafts, they would have needed rope, nets, bags, sail lashings. Without fiber, there is no seafaring. Without seafaring, there are no island settlements. The basket, in this view, may be just as revolutionary as the spear point. And stylistically, the baskets and cordage show continuity with later traditions among the Chumash and other coastal peoples. The weaving techniques echo down the centuries, suggesting cultural lineage, not fragmentation. But as with everything on the Channel Islands, time has not been kind. rising sea levels drowned the coastal shelves where earlier settlements likely existed. Many fiber artifacts remain buried in layers that are difficult to access, and excavation must be cautious to avoid destroying what little remains. Still, the message is clear. Fiber was fundamental. It bound tools, it caught food, it cushioned lives, and for a brief moment, it preserved the gestures of ancient hands that wove their knowledge into every thread. And off those same island shores, beneath the cold Pacific, lie submerged caves and drowned river channels, places where the archaeological record vanishes into salt and silt. Places that might hold the answers we've lost and the stories we haven't yet even begun to ask. Submerged caves and paleo channels off the Central Coast. Beneath the waves of California's Central Coast lies a second coastline, older, quieter, and completely submerged. Stretching offshore from Santa Barbara to Monterey, this drowned world once stood above sea level, part of a broader paleo landscape that was exposed during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. Now, it's hidden beneath meters of water and sediment, holding secrets that are just out of reach. We call it the continental shelf, but that's a modern term for a space that was once home to forests, rivers, lakes, and very possibly people. Around 20,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, sea levels were up to 400 feet lower than today. What's now coastal ocean was then vast open land, connected by river channels, estuaries, and habitable plains. As the glaciers melted and sea levels rose, this land slowly disappeared beneath the encroaching Pacific. The rising ocean didn't just swallow the shore, it erased it. And in doing so, it likely took some of the earliest human sites in California with it. This is where the mystery begins. Archaeologists have long theorized that early peoples in North America followed a coastal migration route, a kelp highway, rich in marine life and ecological niches that offered food, shelter, and mobility to maritime-adapted cultures moving southward from Beringia. But if that's true, then the earliest camps, villages, and watercraft landings would have been located on land that's now underwater, which makes underwater archaeology along California's coast not just intriguing but essential. Unfortunately, it's also incredibly difficult. The waters off the Central Coast are dynamic and cold, with frequent upwelling, strong currents, and poor visibility. Sediment has shifted constantly over millennia, burying or scattering whatever traces early humans might have left behind. Unlike terrestrial archaeology, you can't just walk the site. You need sonar, submersibles, divers, and sometimes blind luck. But in recent years, we've started to get glimpses. In 2020, a multidisciplinary team working off the Santa Barbara Channel Islands used high-resolution seafloor mapping to identify paleochannels' ancient riverbeds now buried beneath the seafloor. These were the arteries of the drowned landscape, likely guiding both animal migrations and human movement. Some of these channels even lead to submerged caves and rock shelters, exactly the kind of environments where archaeological materials might have been preserved. In some places, stone tools have been recovered from nearshore submerged contexts. One notable case involved a barbed point found underwater off the Channel Islands. While not definitively tied to a submerged site, it suggests that materials have been displaced by wave action from older, now drowned contexts. Even more tantalizing are the acoustic anomalies, features detected by sonar that resemble rock overhangs, terraces, or other formations that could shelter archaeological deposits. But until divers can get to them, or until more advanced remote methods are deployed, their potential remains speculative. And that's the core problem. The evidence may be right there, but we can't reach it. Many submerged caves along the Central Coast are technically accessible to divers, but safety, visibility, and funding severely limit exploration. What we need are not just marine archaeologists, but a whole new generation of interdisciplinary teams, bringing together geologists, indigenous experts, climate scientists, and technologists to read a landscape that can no longer be seen. There is also the matter of ethics. Much of this submerged land was once dry ground that may have been occupied by ancestors of modern indigenous peoples. It is not simply blank seafloor to be mined for data. It is part of a cultural geography that has been largely erased by rising water and must be approached with care, collaboration, and humility. Still, the potential is staggering. If we can locate even one well-preserved campsite, one carved tool in situ, one strand of fiber in an underwater cave, then the entire timeline of California's prehistory could shift. Suddenly, the Channel Islands don't look like outposts, they look like hubs. The coast doesn't look marginal, it looks central. But for now, the shelf remains mostly silent, covered in water, shrouded in sediment, waiting. And while some sites have vanished beneath the waves, others remain hidden in plain sight, etched into the granite of foothills, pecked one cup at a time into stone, accumulated across thousands of years, with no known script, but with unmistakable rhythm. They're called cupules, and they're everywhere. But no one agrees on what they mean. Painted rock versus nearby cupules, Carrizo Plain, and Sierra foothills. On the Carrizo Plain, one of California's last great grassland preserves, a sandstone monolith known as Painted Rock juts out like the fossilized jaw of a god. Covered in stunning Chumash pictographs, curving lines, spirals, humanoid figures, and celestial motifs, it's one of the most famous rock art sites in the state. The images glow with ancient presence, even as weather and vandalism have taken their toll. But just beyond the bright pigments and dramatic narratives lies something quieter, and arguably even stranger. Cupules. Small, shallow depressions pecked into stone, not painted, not adorned, just pits, ranging from a few centimeters across to the size of a small fist, often arranged in rows, clusters, or spirals, found not only near Painted Rock, but across the entire state, from the Sierra foothills to the coastal ranges to the desert margins. In many places, they're the most common form of rock art in California, and they remain almost completely uninterpreted. What were they for? One theory posits they were ritual markers used in ceremonies involving grinding pigments, herbs, or hallucinogenic plants. The shallow cups may have served as mortars for preparing offerings or ritual substances. This fits with ethnographic accounts from some native Californian groups who described such activities. Another theory suggests they were water-related, that the cupules collected dew, symbolized rainfall, or played a role in fertility rituals. Some sites are located near springs, seeps, or seasonal pools, and the association is hard to ignore. There's also a more astronomical angle. Some cupules appear to be aligned in rows that may correspond to solar events, constellations, or lunar cycles. But the data here is thin, and without surviving oral traditions to confirm, it's speculative. Then there's the ritual tally hypothesis, that cupules were created one at a time to mark events, births, deaths, seasons, or other significant occurrences. In this view, they're less like messages and more like ritualized timekeeping, calendars carved in negative space. But perhaps the most sobering possibility is that we've misunderstood them entirely. What if cupules are not symbols, but gestures? Not art, but action? The repeated act of pecking stone on stone, rhythm on rhythm, may have been an embodied ritual, where the act itself mattered more than the outcome. In some cultures, such actions are performed to call attention to spirits, ancestors, celestial beings. In others, it's about marking territory, claiming a place in stone through repetition. The truth is, we don't know. Unlike the vibrant paintings of Painted Rock, cupules do not depict anything. They do not narrate. They do not gesture toward identity or cosmology in any literal way. They are negative space, absence made physical. And that makes them nearly impossible to interpret through modern lenses, which crave images, meanings, translations. But they persist. Even where other rock art has eroded, the cupules remain. You can run your fingers across them, feel the texture, Imagine the labor it took, each one likely requiring hours of pecking with hard stone tools. This was not idle doodling. It was investment, focus, return. And their distribution is almost eerily uniform. They appear across cultural zones, language boundaries, and ecological niches, inland and coastal, high and low. This suggests not a single culture's expression, but a pan-regional behavior, one that may span thousands of years of use, adaptation, and reinterpretation. They defy categories, and that's their power. Because just as the pigments at Painted Rock ask you to see, the cupules ask you to feel, not with your eyes, but with your sense of time, the patience of stone. The weight of action repeated so many times that it became invisible. And further up the ridgelines and playas of California, other stone alignments appear lines, not circles this time, rock rows that stretch across mountaintops, deserts, and empty basins. Are they hunting blinds, astronomical maps, or warnings in stone? That's where we're going next, into the linear logic of the unknowable, Sierra and desert stone alignments. California's deserts are full of lines that don't make sense. Long rows of stones stretch across playas, snake up ridgebacks, or wind across plateaus where no obvious settlement ever stood. There's no construction, no house platforms, no visible quarries. Just lines often barely a foot high, sometimes hundreds of feet long, always deliberate. They're called stone alignments, and they exist in the Sierra Nevada foothills, the Mojave Desert, and parts of the Great Basin. And like everything else carved or arranged into California's prehistory, no one agrees what they were for. You don't notice them at first. The desert has a way of swallowing detail, but once you see one, you begin to see them everywhere, tracing invisible maps across the land. Some are straight, others curve. Some terminate in piles or cairns, others intersect with no clear purpose. There are alignments made from large boulders, carefully selected and spaced. Others are more like trails, with small cobbles arranged in single file. Most aren't marked, few are protected. Some have already been bulldozed by mining operations or misidentified as ranch-era artifacts. But those that remain offer a strange, silent geometry, the architecture of intention without explanation. So what were they? The most common theory is hunting blinds. That is, these alignments could have been used to funnel game antelope, bighorn sheep, or even waterfowl into kill zones or trap areas. The rocks wouldn't have been barriers, exactly, but visual cues, psychological fences used to guide animal movement. In this scenario, hunters would have hidden behind adjacent cairns or blinds, ready to strike. This is supported by a few examples near dry lake beds and mountain passes, natural choke points where animals would have traveled. Ethnographic analogs from other parts of the world support this idea. But many alignments are in odd locations, far from any obvious kill site or water source. Too high, too exposed, or simply too long to make practical sense. So others argue they're ceremonial, that the lines marked ritual paths, processional routes, or cosmological patterns. In this view, they were walked, not watched, aligned with solstice points, mountain vistas, or ancestral sites now lost to erosion and time. Some may even represent songlines, pathways embedded in oral tradition, where movement through space was also movement through story. Then there are the territorial theories that these lines demarcated clan boundaries, foraging zones, or sacred precincts. A way of saying, this is ours, beyond here is someone else's. But California's indigenous nations tended to mark territory through knowledge and relationships, not fences of stone. If alignments had this function, they were likely symbolic, not administrative. Still others reach for the stars literally. Some lines appear to align with astronomical features, solstice sunrises, lunar standstills, or prominent star risings. Could these be prehistoric observatories, like desert Stonehenges? Perhaps, but the evidence is scattered, and while some lines point at the right angles, others don't point at anything at all. And of course, there's the theory that makes archaeologists shift in their seats. We don't know because we're asking the wrong questions. Maybe these alignments weren't meant to do anything in the way we think of utility. Maybe they were acts of presence, ways of leaving memory in stone, labor as devotion, motion made material. Marking not space, but time. The problem is that very few of these sites have been rigorously excavated. Many are in remote areas, some are now on military or private land. And because they lack pottery, bone, or datable materials, they often escape the radar of mainstream archaeology. They're hard to date, harder to interpret, and easiest of all to ignore. But indigenous communities don't always see them as mysterious. In some oral traditions, alignments are acknowledged as pathways of the ancestors. Places where songs were sung, prayers were left, or knowledge was transferred across terrain. They aren't explained in English. They don't need to be. What they all have in common is intentionality. These lines didn't form by chance. They were placed, rock by rock, hand by hand, which makes them less a mystery and more of a mirror showing us how far we still are from understanding the landscape we walk across. And just off the coast from some of these inland alignments is another set of patterns, this time in points, not lines, delicate barbed projectile tips crafted on the Channel Islands. Tools, weapons, or symbols? No one's sure. But they point to something even sharper: identity, coded in stone. Channel Islands, barbed points, variation. On the wave-battered shores of the Channel Islands, archaeologists began unearthing barbed projectile points that looked unlike anything found on the mainland. Intricately shaped, often stemmed or tanged, and frequently featuring multiple barbs along one or both edges, these points form a distinctive technological tradition that has come to be known as the Channel Island barbed style. They are beautiful in their own way, delicate, aerodynamic, and functionally complex. But their real mystery lies not in their shape, but in their variation. Because while the general form persists over centuries, the subtypes shift subtly but meaningfully across both time and space. Some barbs are long and narrow, others short and recurved. Some stems are squared off, others rounded. Some points are made of local chert or volcanic rock. Others, especially in later periods, are crafted from imported obsidian, hinting at trade or movement. This variation has led to a decades-long debate. Do these point styles reflect different cultural groups, different tool functions, or just slow stylistic drift over time? The stakes are higher than they sound. If the differences represent distinct cultural traditions, then we might be looking at multiple interacting populations on the islands trading, intermarrying, or even competing. If they're functional, then the variety might reflect specialized uses: barbs for fish, birds, or sea mammals, variations adapted for different hunting techniques or prey types. And if it's just style drift, then the points become like a lithic dialect, a slow evolution in taste and technique, passed from napper to apprentice across generations. The points themselves have been found in a range of contexts: coastal camps, middens, burial sites, and inland shelters. Many are associated with paleo-coastal peoples, maritime foragers and fishers who made expert use of the island environment as early as 11,000, 12,000 years ago. These were not accidental arrivals. They were skilled seafarers, and their tools reflect an intimate knowledge of both land and sea. What complicates things further is that similar barbed points have been found on the mainland, though not as frequently and with notable differences. This raises more questions. Did the islanders innovate independently? Or did they modify mainland styles to suit island lifeways? Was there constant exchange between island and coast, or periods of isolation that led to divergent technologies? Some researchers argue for a model of regional adaptation. In this view, island life required different tools, especially for hunting marine birds, seals, and fishing in rocky coves. Barbed points may have offered better retention, especially when striking fast-moving or slippery targets. Others suggest the barbs were as much symbolic as functional markers of identity, ritual status, or lineage. Indeed, Some points found in burial contexts show signs of being made specifically for interment, finely crafted, unused, and sometimes made from rare materials. These weren't tools. They were symbols of who someone was, or what they wanted to be remembered as. And just as we start to get a handle on the typology, the exceptions multiply. Some sites show hybrid forms, points that blend island and mainland traits. Others seem to break the pattern entirely. There are also changes over time, with earlier points being more robust and later ones increasingly delicate, possibly reflecting changes in prey species, environmental shifts, or shifts in cultural priorities. But as with all archaeology, the stone is only part of the story. What we lack is context, the oral traditions, the language, the names of the people who made these points, and what those names meant. What we're left with is variation without consensus, a stone-based language that we can read phonetically, but not fluently. And yet, these barbed points may still be pointing towards something bigger, not just tools, but roots. Which brings us full circle to one of the biggest questions in California prehistory. How did people get here in the first place? And that means looking again not inland, but seaward, to a coastal corridor that may have carried the first Californians south before the interior was even habitable. It's called the Kelp Highway, and it may be the oldest road in the state. Early coastal voyaging routes. Long before Route 1 ever snaked its way along the cliffs of Big Sur, before gas stations, beach towns, or ferry lines, the western edge of North America was a corridor of kelp, sea mammals, shellfish, and possibility. An ancient thoroughfare that may have carried the first human footsteps into California, even as the great ice sheets still throttled the inland paths. This is the story of the Kelp Highway hypothesis, a theory that turns our oldest migration maps inside out. For much of the 20th century, the dominant model of human migration into the Americas was a land-based one. People crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia into Alaska during the last ice age, then funneled southward through an inland corridor between two receding glaciers around 13,000 years ago. They followed big game, left Clovis points in their wake, and slowly populated the continent. Clean, linear, convenient. But increasingly, this story doesn't fit the evidence, especially in California. Sites like Arlington Springs, Daisy Cave, and the Channel Islands' barbed point assemblages suggest people were living on the California coast well before the inland corridor was viable. We're talking 13,000 years ago, maybe earlier. But if the interior route was blocked by ice until after that, how did these people get here? Enter the Kelp Highway. The theory proposes that maritime-adapted peoples equipped with watercraft, fishing tools, and deep ecological knowledge migrated along the Pacific Rim, hugging the coastline from Northeast Asia down into the Americas. This corridor would have been rich in food, seaweeds, shellfish, seabirds, seals, and fish. In other words, a living buffet, and one that required none of the specialized big-game hunting tools associated with Clovis culture. The coast also had fewer obstacles, no ice sheets to breach, no mountain passes to scale, just a string of micro-ecosystems, navigable shorelines, and floating forests of kelp to guide the way. These underwater forests not only provided food, but served as natural breakwaters, calming the surf and creating predictable zones of marine productivity. The idea isn't radical anymore. It's gaining support, but it still raises more questions than it answers. First, where are the sites? The problem is that during the last ice age, sea levels were significantly lower by up to 400 feet. That means the ancient coastline and any settlements on it is now submerged. Archaeological traces of those first voyagers may lie beneath hundreds of feet of cold Pacific water, buried in sediment and out of reach. The very evidence we need to confirm the hypothesis has been swallowed by time and tide. Second, what kind of boats did they use? No Pleistocene-era watercraft has ever been found in California. Organic materials like wood, hide, or reed don't preserve well in coastal environments. But the need for boats is not really in question. To reach the Channel Islands, for example, one had to cross at least 7 to 12 kilometers of open water, even during periods of lower sea level. That's not something you wade across, that's a voyage. Third, how early could this have happened? If people were already on the coast by 13,000 years ago, then the initial migration must have occurred well before that. Some researchers push dates back to 16,000 or even 18,000 years ago, which aligns with recent finds in Oregon, Idaho, and Baja California. This challenges long-held assumptions and reshuffles the order of arrival across the continent. But the Kelp Highway isn't just a hypothesis about movement, it's also about identity. Coastal peoples weren't necessarily following herds or fleeing glaciers. They were seafarers, explorers, traders. Their toolkit included fiber, shell, fish hooks, and planks. Their rhythms followed tides, not seasons. Their world was lateral, not vertical, and their understanding of environment was woven into the water itself. This kind of life leaves fewer footprints both literally and archaeologically. No massive kill sites, no stone walls, just shell middens, woven nets, driftwood shrines, and stories passed down in languages now sleeping. And it redefines what it means to be first, because the first Californians may not have come with spears and mammoth dreams. They may have come with baskets, boats, and the memory of coastal forests half a world away. Of course, interpreting early migration patterns through the lens of archaeology is always a bit like listening to a whisper through a wall. Every answer breeds a new silence. And on that note, speaking of silence, let's return to the land. To a place where silence is carved in geometric patterns across stone, where messages, if they exist, are encoded in shapes and forms that no modern person can read. The figures repeat, but their meaning does not. They're found at a place called Petroglyph Point, and what they say or don't say is still very much an open question. Petroglyph Point's geometric lexicon. Petroglyph Point doesn't look like the kind of place that should be sacred. It sits just outside Tula Lake, in the far northeastern corner of California, near the Oregon border, flat agricultural land. Lava beds, quiet, stark, but then you get closer and closer, and you see them thousands upon thousands of carved symbols etched into the cliff face surrounding what was once an island in prehistoric Tule Lake. They don't depict deer, or people, or sun gods. They're shapes, grids, loops, ladders, concentric circles, zigzags, dozens of repeating motifs, some deeply incised, others barely more than scratches. The density is astonishing, over 5,000 individual carvings concentrated in a relatively small area. It's not just a collection, it's a lexicon, but one written in a language no one can read. Dating the petroglyphs is nearly impossible. There's no organic pigment, no datable materials in direct context. The prevailing theory is that they could be anywhere from 2,000 to 6,000 years old, with some possibly older. But without clear stratigraphy or associated artifacts, even these ranges are speculative. So what do they mean? Some researchers propose that the carvings represent astronomical records, charts of lunar cycles, solar positions, or star patterns. The repeating grids and line segments could be calendar systems used to track the passage of time or mark ceremonial dates. Others see in the motifs a kind of clan symbology, marks left by different family groups or spiritual practitioners who visited the island during important events. In this interpretation, the petroglyphs aren't messages for outsiders, but signatures, personal or tribal emblems carved in stone. Still others argue for a water symbology. The site was once surrounded by Tule Lake, a massive freshwater body now mostly drained. The concentric circles and undulating lines might represent ripples, springs, or water sources. In many native Californian traditions, water isn't just physical, it's spiritual, a living force, a threshold. But the most provocative interpretation is that we're dealing with a ritual code, one that's not meant to be read by us at all. The act of carving may have been more important than the content, a physical offering, a trance-based activity, a meditation encoded in marks. Of course, there's also the possibility that these interpretations are all wrong and all right. Petroglyph Point may have served multiple functions over millennia, its meanings evolving with each new visitor, each new layer of memory. Complicating matters further is the fact that many of these carvings were made with stone tools against dense volcanic tuff. This wasn't casual work. It took time, effort, and intentionality. Why here? Why so many? Why only geometric patterns? One answer may lie in its visibility. As a former island, Petroglyph Point would have been highly prominent, rising from the water like a sentinel. Anyone canoeing across Tule Lake would have seen it from miles away. Perhaps it was a gathering site, a marker, a destination for ceremony or pilgrimage. The sheer scale of the petroglyphs implies communal use, not individual expression. And yet, the island is now landlocked. The lake is mostly gone. The carvings are slowly eroding, battered by wind, rain, and disinterest. Some are protected under the Lava Beds National Monument, but others are fading, lost not to vandalism, but to irrelevance, our inability to imagine what mattered to the people who carved them. Because if you stare long enough at Petroglyph Point's symbols, you might start to see patterns where none exist. Or worse, you might realize that the patterns only exist for those who already know the story. And we don't. But stories don't stop just because we can't read them. Further down the Colorado River, similar symbols appear, but on a vastly larger scale. They weren't carved in stone. They were scratched into the desert floor. Massive, visible only from above, and even less understood. Who made the Blythe region ground figures beyond the famous trio? Hover over the lower Colorado River Valley, and you might catch a glimpse of a mystery too large to notice from the ground. Etched into the desert crust near Blythe, California, are some of the largest geoglyphs in North America, massive ground figures that only reveal their full form when viewed from high above. They're called intaglios, but the term barely captures their size, complexity, or strangeness. The most famous of these, known collectively as the Blythe intaglios, include 3 human-like figures, a handful of animals, and some abstract shapes, massive outlines scraped into the dark desert pavement, exposing the lighter soil beneath. The largest humanoid figure stretches over 170 feet from head to toe. These are California's Nazca lines, but unlike Peru's, they've received a fraction of the study, protection, or attention. And what's even more mysterious? They're not alone. Across the wider Blythe region, stretching along the lower Colorado River and fanning out into the surrounding desert, there are dozens more ground figures, many undocumented, most unstudied, and nearly all of uncertain origin. We don't know who made them. We don't know when, and we definitely don't know why. These figures appear in a variety of forms, humanoid shapes with outstretched arms, quadrupeds that resemble mountain lions or bighorn sheep, and serpentine lines that twist and spiral with no clear meaning. Some are found in isolation. Others occur in clusters. Some are protected by fences. Others are eroding into dust. Unlike petroglyphs or pictographs, which leave behind tools, pigments, or debris, these geoglyphs leave almost no archaeological context. They were created by removing rocks, not adding anything. And in the dry desert environment, they can survive for centuries, or even millennia, but they don't tell us when they were born. A few have been dated indirectly, using nearby artifacts, oral traditions, or radiocarbon samples from associated features like hearths or trails. These estimates range wildly, from a few hundred to over 1,000 years ago, but none of the dates are definitive, and none explain the full scope of the tradition. Some believe the intaglios were created by the ancestors of the Quechan, Mojave, or Halchidhoma peoples tribes, whose traditional territories overlap with the Colorado River corridor. Oral histories from these groups speak of giant spirit beings, ceremonial trails, and sky-watching rituals that may connect to the geoglyphs. One figure near Blythe is believed by some to represent Mustamho, a creator deity in Mojave cosmology. Others interpret the figures as guardian spirits, ancestral beings, or territorial markers. Still others believe they may have functioned as parts of vision quests or ceremonial pilgrimages seen only by initiates who understood their significance. But that's one interpretation among many. The real issue is that we're looking at symbols whose meaning was never meant for strangers. These are not public works in the modern sense. They were likely ritual features, embedded in a cultural landscape, shaped by oral tradition, spiritual geography, and social memory. And then there's the scale problem. Why make a figure so large that you can't see it from ground level? This suggests a very different relationship with space and meaning, one where the point wasn't to be seen in a glance, but to be participated in. Maybe you walked the outline. Maybe it was aligned with stars. Maybe it was marked by the movement of light, shadow, or the passage of time. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a message meant not for humans, but for the sky itself. Add to that the fact that modern development has obliterated many of these figures. Agriculture, off-roading, and construction have taken their toll. Some geoglyphs survive only in aerial photos from the 1,930 seconds. Others may be gone without anyone even knowing they existed. Which leads to a quiet tragedy. We may never know how many ground figures once marked this desert. And we may never know how many are still out there, faded but not gone. What remains are outlines both literal and metaphorical. Lines that draw our attention to absence, symbols whose meanings evaporated with the cultures that once animated them. But further west, where cliffs overlook the ocean and the wind smells of salt instead of dust, there are other markings, rock art perched on coastal bluffs with panoramic views of the Pacific. Why place art where only the sky and seabirds can see? That's the mystery of Honda Ridge, and it's our next stop. Honda Ridge and other coast-overlooking rock art sites, Vandenberg area. If you stand atop Honda Ridge, on the rugged coast of what is now Vandenberg Space Force Base, and look west, you'll see nothing but the rolling blue infinity of the Pacific Ocean. Wind, cliff, salt, and sky. But nestled into this stark landscape high above sea level, in places few people now visit, are panels of prehistoric rock art, carved or painted by hands that vanished long before history arrived. These aren't decorated caves or shaded canyon walls. These are perched panels, exposed and windswept, facing the ocean, which raises an immediate question: why here? The rock art at Honda Ridge and other high coastal sites in the region is often minimalist. Faint red ochre marks, geometric shapes, sometimes figures or abstract glyphs that resemble constellations or cosmological symbols. The motifs don't match those found in the better-known Chumash cave sites inland. They seem sparser, more elemental, almost like shorthand for something bigger. And what they lack in complexity, they make up for in placement. These sites are hard to reach. You have to climb, navigate. In some cases, you need permission from military authorities just to access the zone. Yet the people who created this art chose these exact places. Places where you can see for miles. Places where the sun sets into the sea like a clock into its cradle. So, again, why here? One interpretation holds that these panels were used for celestial observation. The western sky, after all, is a predictable canvas. Solstices, equinoxes, star risings, lunar cycles. It's possible the rock art was part of a seasonal calendar, activated by sunlight or moonlight striking the panels at specific times of year. Others see the coastal rock art as ceremonial markers, spaces for ritual, vision questing, or offerings. The ocean was not just a resource. It was a being, a boundary, a road to the spirit world. The art may have marked the edge of the known world, a place where messages were sent to ancestors or deities beyond the horizon. Then there's the idea that these panels were signals visible from the sea, meant to communicate with boats or canoes arriving from elsewhere. If the Chumash or their ancestors were seafarers, which the evidence suggests, then these high cliffs could have served as wayfinding landmarks with symbolic tags to guide or welcome. But what complicates everything is the lack of narrative. Unlike the inland painted cave or Carrizo plain panels, which often tell stories or depict characters, the Honda Ridge art is quiet, repetitive. It doesn't shout, it doesn't explain itself. And maybe that's the point. Maybe these were places to listen, not speak. Places where ritual wasn't about display, but about orientation, spatial, spiritual, existential. When you sit by these panels at sunset, it's easy to imagine the art wasn't meant to be seen in isolation, but in context with wind, wave, light, and horizon all part of the message. Today, many of these sites are off-limits or poorly documented. Some survive in military zones, ironically protected by restricted access. Others are endangered by erosion, development, or indifference. And while indigenous communities still hold knowledge about coastal ritual sites, much of it has been displaced, fragmented, or protected from outsiders as it should be. What we do know is this: the art on Honda Ridge doesn't mark the end of the world. It marks a threshold between land and sea, silence and story, presence and loss. And that's where we leave it. The final mystery isn't the figures, the lines, or the tools. It's what all of them point to: the fact that California's deepest past still speaks. We just haven't figured out the language. And maybe we never will.